minutes, that's really quite a...
Give it a little wiggle.
Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to call the Board of Equalization meeting back into session. It is 2:21, 2. I would like to just acknowledge that we have a slight modification to our presenting list. I'd like to, oh, actually, Mr. Ketty, maybe you could call up our next speakers for me.
I could be happy to call the speakers, but it would be good if we let everyone know, everyone know that we are taking some items out of order.
That's right, okay.
We are taking item 4 up first before item 3. The next item on the board work group agenda, item number 4, is overview of current property tax incentives in California, presented by David Young, Deputy Director, Property Tax Department at the State Board of Equalization.
Thank you, Mr. Ketty, for calling that item. And actually, we are going to hear from Mr. Young. We're going to hear this presentation next month at our next meeting in August.
All righty.
So what we're going to do, where we're going to go now is go back to section 3, and we're going to talk about the color of housing, systemic racism, equity, and access to capital and financing. If you could call those speakers.
Be happy to.
Thank you.
The next item on the board work group is item number 3 on this agenda, the color of housing, systemic racism, equity, and access to capital and financing. The speakers are Deborah Gorman, President and CEO of Green Lining Institute. And then we're going to have some co-presenters, Noreen Limon, Executive Vice President, Public Policy and Industry Relations with the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals, and Beatrice B. Oliveira Stoters, co-founder, Women's Law Center and New Economics for Women, CEO, New Capital LLC, and member of the Women and Girls Initiative Governing Council, County of Los Angeles.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us today. Let me see. Mr. Vasquez, do you know if Gary Acosta or Beatrice? No, I didn't.
She's replacing Gary.
Okay,
They're on Teams.
they're on Teams.
They should be on.
Thank you very much. There she is.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you for that. I didn't realize that. Ms. Limon, thank you for being here with us today. We're going to first hear from Ms. Deborah Gorman, who's the President and CEO of Green Lining Institute, and then we'll come back to you. Okay, Ms. Limon? Thank you. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Deborah Gorman. I'm the President and CEO of the Green Lining Institute. I thought I'd do some level setting here. Green Lining Institute was founded in 1993, built on community coalition. And we work towards a future where communities of color can build wealth, live in healthy places filled with economic opportunity, and are ready to meet the challenges posed by climate change. We center racial equity, and let me take the moment to just define for you how we define racial equity. We see that as transforming the behaviors, institutions, and systems to ensure that communities of color thrive and reach their potential. So Green Lining, we work at the intersection of economic equity and climate equity with place-based community involvement. That's our true North Star. And when we are doing our economic equity work, we focus on 4 main areas: home ownership, small business, financial institutions, and these are the big banks. We've been working with them for over 30 years now, and broadband and algorithmic bias as it relates to economic opportunity. When we are doing home ownerships, we do focus on the 5 Ps, if you've heard about those: production, protection, preservation, participation, and placement. In particular, as you've heard all morning, production is key in the work that we do in home ownership as well. And we've lifted up participation because the community has been telling us the needs that they have. As it relates to the economic equity, Green Lining focuses on the transfer of wealth. As you've heard earlier today, and I think it was Jason who mentioned, Black families have 60% of the income of white families, but Black families have 10% of the wealth of white families. So you would think with 60% of income, you'd have 60% of the wealth. That is not true, because in the calculation of wealth is home ownership and the appreciation of home ownership. And since the Black home ownership has been about 40%, has not increased since the 60s, that is due to the housing and the home ownership component. As our economic equity work has shown us in working closely with community, that the production side and the home ownership does have to do a lot with what you've heard today. Streamlining, CEQA, and that it's high to include affordable local. The work that we do also is with labor unions and working towards fair wages, and you heard that also from some of the participants before. On the climate equity side, which now we see through the pandemic, that the wildfires in California have linked residents, neighborhoods to health. And so we have now seen climate refugees, which adds to the housing dilemma or the crisis. And we are working with energy companies, so PG&E, SoCal Gas, with regards to the public safety power shutoffs, which affects where you live, what neighborhood you live in, and which neighborhoods get shut off, as well as community needs as cooling stations and farm worker needs are all climate equity that we see are coupled with the housing equity crisis. So listening to what others say, I wanted to add different perspectives to this conversation. Greenlining has been working, as I said, the last 30 years with the big banks. In particular, we've been seeing the banking consolidation. So just in California, we've been impacted. Last year, U.S. Bank is acquiring Union Bank, and we have been negotiating with them a $100 billion community benefits agreement. We testified and provided public statements to both the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, as well as the OCC. And most recently in this year, BMO has put in a request for acquisition of Bank of the West.
What,
and Bank
I'm sorry,
of the West,
BMO, what is that acronym?
the Bank of Montreal,
Got it.
but they have a headquartered in Chicago.
Okay.
So the bank consolidation is real for California. We are in the process of negotiating as well a community benefits agreement with them. In the community benefits agreement, the 4 pillars that we always negotiate, and on BMO Bank of the West, we're right now on $100 billion over 5-year community benefits agreements. The 4 pillars: home ownership, small business, financial literacy, and philanthropy. So we are at the table in significant ways of getting community resources. And similarly, the policy work we do has to do with a lot of the ARPA money you see coming from the federal to the state. We're including the community in that.
And
as
I'm
it
sorry,
relates to-
ARPA?
Oh, it's the it's the relief fund. It's the federal it's the federal relief fund under the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration. And can somebody help me with ARPA?
American Recovery.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so we are also looking at that as stacked capital, right? The public funds, the private funds, getting to communities that need it most. So as it relates to home ownership, that's how we're seeing the development of approaching the issues and tackling the issues before us. We also see in this process, which I think is how we would frame the CEQA conversation, as procedural equity. When there are times to go to City Hall or convene community meetings, those are done in the middle of the day for people who are hourly workers cannot attend, or they're done in the evenings where there's no childcare. We call that procedural equity. So by the process then precludes our communities of color. And the other thing that we see through this procedural equity, since segregation has been outlawed since the 60s and the early 70s, but segregation is pernicious and ongoing. And the procedural part of that continues to segregate our neighborhoods. And so as we start to look at home ownership and how to address it and how to use tax abatement as a tool, we would offer that the perspective of the way that the housing market, the real estate association, the bankers, that there is a de jure practice of keeping neighborhoods segregated. And so we would offer that perspective and that lens be brought to bear when you are considering sort of tax abatement and what programs to do. We also would offer that there should be some standards, that you set some standards while you're evaluating what you would, how we would use the public funds and the tax abatement. One, that there is equitable access, that it be safe, that it be affordable. You've heard a lot about affordability. That it be healthy. We know, in full disclosure, my daughter interned for when Ms. Cohen was on the Board of Supervisor, and in San Francisco, we have Bayview Hunters Point, which has been battling for years about the health impacts there, that there be labor rights and that there be economic and climate justice. And again, in the what we have learned and what we have seen in working with the banks is that when you do the private-public partnerships, there is a conflict, inherent conflict with the public good and the public funds and the need to maximize shareholders' wealth or maximize the net income. And there's where we have seen the predatory practices. That's where we saw subprime come in and target communities of color. That's when we've seen, most recently, the assessment that homes owned by Black and brown folks were valued less than the homes owned by white census tract families. Those are all real things that are happening that if we do not have intent on focusing on some of those issues, we may replicate it or exacerbate it through the tax abatement. So we have seen that the banks have a disparate treatment of communities of color as it relates to housing and a disparate impact. So we would make sure that those standards be included and that as we evaluate these options being offered, that you can have a mind's eye to that and address that simultaneously. I would also add that in dealing with affordable housing, you will also be dealing with education, because as we know, based on the housing and because education is funded through taxes, you'll be dealing with the health of the community because the integration of communities and I think it was referred to as some mixed income will create different lived experiences all through housing, all through home ownership. And likewise, there are still practices that are happening in the community that continue to keep communities segregated. We heard a little bit about the Not in My Backyard, NIMBY, which is really about property values. That there is a myth that if I bring in low-income folks or if I bring in people of color, my property value will be decreased. That is a myth. That is, I would say, artifacts and relics of previous segregational practices that we have in the community. So the facts and the data will bear that out. So this for Greenlining Institute is an opportunity to keep those in mind so that we don't repeat those. And that we could have an opportunity here to then create the multi-generational wealth that others have presented today. I think. So lastly, let me offer some practices. Couple of the tools that are used when looking at working with banks or working with the local communities. New market tax credits have been used. I think demonstrated some of the wonderful projects that we've seen in the community that have used that instrument, a tax instrument. EIFDs, which, and I know Supervisor Cohen, you're going to, EIFDs are also, as a financing district, are also tools. So the financial instruments do work as it relates to making some of these changes. And then lastly, I would say that there's a serious commitment to addressing the climate change issues, and those resources are really coming to bear. So you have BlackRock, who's an asset manager of billions of dollars. We had a discussion with CalPERS. I serve on the San Francisco Federal Reserve Board with President Mary Daly. There are conversations about those resources being brought to neighborhoods. So if there's vehicle electrification, the charging stations will be equitably distributed, which means that money will be equitably distributed. And there was a previous speaker who talked also about infrastructure and how infrastructure also supports housing. So we see those movements all coming together, which will bring additional resources to support the tax abatement that you all are hoping to do today. So I will leave it there. So much more to share, but I really want to thank you for allowing Greenlining the opportunity to share a perspective on how the work that you're doing on the workforce might be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate your enthusiasm and the new vocabulary in your presentation. I'm trying to take copious notes as you're making your presentation. Again, colleagues, we're going to save questions for afterwards. We are now going to go to Ms. Limon. Can you just introduce yourself to us, and the floor is yours. Thank you. Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, first of all, I am going to share my screen real quick. I'm not sure if you're able to see this. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Perfect. So first of all, my name is Norena Limon. I'm the EVP for policy for the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. I want to thank the California State Board of Equalization and especially member Tony Vasquez for inviting NARP to participate in this hearing on this topic. So I am here representing the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals, which is a national trade association with a mission to advance sustainable homeownership for Latinos, as we are passionately focused on bridging the widening wealth gap in America. We are here because we believe that any conversation around the economic mobility of communities starts with housing. Housing is the center of family, of culture, all centered around walls that nurture and provide stability. Currently, we are facing a housing shortage crisis across the board, and we commend all of the ideas floated around today to use tax abatements to accelerate the production of more housing. I'm here to talk about an aspect of housing we don't talk enough about, which is homeownership. And the lack of rental housing has also meant that more families are cost burdened than ever before. The supply challenges we find ourselves in make it harder to save enough money for the down payments that are needed to get offers accepted in today's real estate market. At NARP, we've calculated that Latino homeowners have 28 times the wealth as Latino renters. That means that Latino households who have been able to purchase a home have a median household wealth of just over $170,000 compared to only $6,000 for renters, underscoring the seismic economic leaps a family can make through owning a home. However, access to homeownership has become out of reach for many, particularly for those that don't have access to generational wealth. So in terms of the color of housing, the topic of today, I want to say that the Latino homeownership rate has increased to 48.4%. However, in California, the Latino homeownership rate is 43.5%, ranking 36th in the nation in terms of its Latino homeownership rate. The Black homeownership rate is 38.6%. All of this compared to the 63.6% of the non-Hispanic white population. I do want to point out that San Bernardino, Riverside, Ontario metro areas in California, locally known as the Inland Empire, produced the most new Latino homeowners between 2019 and 2021, adding a total of just over 88,000 new Latino owner households. The Los Angeles area ranked 5th and Fresno was 7th. Despite the housing hurdles California faces, the state still plays a critical role in the national Latino homeownership story and must continue to do so for the sake of the U.S. economy. Following the Great Recession, Latinos actually drove homeownership and household formation growth. And in terms of demographic projections, this is consistent to where the nation needs to be in order to ensure a healthy real estate market and in turn a US economy. However, in a sharp reversal of trends since 2017, it's been the non-Hispanic white population that's driven growth in both of these categories. This pendulum shift coincides with historic drops in housing inventory. In fact, in 2021, it dropped to as low as 2.3 months supply, which is the lowest ever recorded. So what's happened is that many Latino would-be first-time home buyers and many first-time home buyers of color have been priced out. And those who could rely on generational wealth were just in a better position to take advantage of the low interest rates that occurred over the past 2 years, not so much now, and especially with the announcement that was just made earlier today. So let's get to the root issue. No other issue is impacting the homeownership rate more than the low supply of housing. In no state is there a more severe housing crisis than in California, the country's most populous Latino state. The graph here shows the big discrepancies that exist between the median household income for Latinos and the income needed to be able to afford the median priced home. We spoke earlier about the role that the Inland Empire plays in increasing the national Latino homeownership rate, yet housing underproduction has significantly worsened there, as well as in the San Diego market. Additionally, like much of the country, we heard from the earlier speaker about this issue, but Latino would-be home buyers are losing a significant portion of housing stock to institutional investors. Several markets experienced investors purchase shares as high as 42% in Q3 of last year. San Mateo, Santa Clara, Orange County, Los Angeles, and San Bernardino County, in that order, all had 36% or higher of the properties purchased by investors. I challenge this group to develop tax credits that will incentivize sellers to sell their homes or their vacation or short-term rental homes to first-time home buyers. So to paint a picture of the realities faced by first-time home buyers, according to a Realtor.com survey, 69% of Latinos took part in a bidding war. Most respondents in our own survey reported that the average home in their market received between 6 and 20 offers, with the highest number of offers reported being 114 for a single home. This was a participant in Sacramento, California. And in most of the most populous Latino counties, more than half of the properties in the market in 2021 sold over listing price, meaning that the difference in appraised value came out of pocket. I want to zero in on the graph on the right that shows that 6 out of the 10 counties in the country were in California. On the left, I rank California counties. In San Joaquin County, 66.9% sold over asking, and in San Bernardino County, 62% sold over asking. This is all a result of our housing supply crisis from affordable housing on up, and no product is more underproduced or has the least incentives than the building of entry-level housing for first-time home buyers. And yes, we are a Latino organization, hence why our data focuses on the Latino population, but I do want to stress that these numbers are truly a California issue. Over the past decade, Latinos accounted for 68.6% of the population growth in California, and projections show that these trends will only continue. The Urban Institute predicts that Latinos will account for 70% of homeownership growth over the past 20 years. This is all based on demographics, not on the realities of today's real estate market. Inventory challenges must be solved, and tax incentives to spur the production of housing is an economic imperative. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Let's see, is there I think we have, just so correct me if I'm wrong, Gary Acosta is not speaking today. Okay. She was okay. And is Beatrice Stolzer? Okay. Ms. Stotzer? Are you on? Do you see her on? You don't see her on her? Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, that's great. We can have a more focused conversation. So we've got Ms. Gorman and we've got Ms. Limon for questions, if anyone has any. Mr. Vasquez, you look like you've got a couple questions.
Got a couple here.
Okay.
Let me start with Ms. Limon. You know, when you gave us so much information there on the housing front, Now, is it your group's opinion or theory that if we can create more affordable housing, it would help home ownership as well, especially among populations of color?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a housing supply crisis across the board. So everything is causing a downstream effect. So the crisis in the supply of affordable housing means that less families are able to save enough money for a down payment and are able to achieve homeownership in their lifetime. So we need housing across the board. Absolutely.
And then I guess this is more of a question maybe for Ms. Mann here. On your job is, or it sounds like your group is really focused more on the lending side, making sure that banks are doing the responsible thing in terms of making it easier, I guess, or equitable, I should say, for families of color who want to take out a loan. And I know in the past, there's been that history where they, obviously discriminated against people of color. And in some cases, even of those that had the money weren't even allowed to purchase property, especially in California.
Yeah, I'd say that's one pillar of our work. We do a lot of policy and legislative work as well to write the policy, and I would agree with some of the comments made before about enforcing the current guidelines and regulations. So we do policy work as well.
Okay. And along those lines, as your group come up with some potential or possible, I guess I would say legislation, even though we're not in the position to advocate for legislation, but we could support things.
Yeah, we're supporting about 20 legislative
Oh,
bills
wow.
on housing right now, so there's quite a few, and significantly on climate as well. And we try to, again, sit at that intersection of bills that support building healthy communities, but also with economic opportunity. So there's quite a few bills right now that are being assessed and coming through the committee work.
And this is, I guess, a question for both of you. Just recently, we had a proposition that passed, Prop 19, and I don't know what your take is, especially when we're talking about ownership and, the intergenerational wealth. If either one of your groups had any clue that this thing was, one, brewing, and that now that it passed, the impact that might have on both of your missions.
Who's your question towards?
Either one.
Well, I'll let her
Oh,
go.
okay, go ahead.
I'll give her opportunity. Go ahead.
Okay.
Ms. Limon, do you want to take a stab at that?
We did not take a position on that issue.
We didn't either. I was just, we did not either.
That's what I was-
But, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps in the future, we should be taking
Yeah,
positions.
exactly. Well, now that-
Because you see what happens when you don't take a position. Let me look on my left. Gentlemen, any questions for the ladies, for our presenters? All right. This has been incredibly enlightening and important part of our conversation. It is always important to remember the systems that we are living in and that we are operating under, and also understanding it from a historic perspective, how we got to where we are today, because that really helps guide the conversation as we move forward into the future. And as we will continue this conversation, what we produce here, we will share with you, so that we can collectively make sure that we're talking to each other as we look at different initiatives, whether they're legislative, whether they're, or tax incentives. Either way, that is what we are all exploring today. So thank you for your time and your presentation. Thank you for being with us all day. I hope you got something out of it.
I did. Thank you so much.
I'm glad to hear that. Ms. Limon, I hope to see you in person, and I'll be following up directly with you with more detailed questions. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for holding this important hearing.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting her.
No, and thank you, because it was kind of last minute, but I'm glad that Gary made the recommendation, because you had some real good information.
Okay, we are going to keep moving forward. We're going to go to.
Oh, Madam Chair, I understand, remember you were asking for Josh Hamilton? I
Yes.
understand he's on the line.
Oh, he's on now?
Yeah.
Mr. Hamilton, are you on?
I am on. Can
That's
you guys hear me?
Oh,
See
yes,
me?
absolutely. Please, go ahead and present to us. Lindsay, introduce yourself to us and Let's hear your thoughts.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Yeah, my name is Josh Hamilton. I am a senior vice president here at Century Housing. And Century is a nonprofit CDFI lender that provides early stage financing for affordable housing projects throughout California. So, my job here is to oversee the lending operation and to make sure that we are meeting every opportunity that we possibly can to infuse capital to developers of affordable housing at the very early stage of their development. And so, most of what we do, we have a number of different loan products, but, our bread and butter loan product is an acquisition loan for a developer to acquire land that will eventually be developed into affordable housing. And, unfortunately, it takes, typically, but, sometimes up to 2 to 3 years for developers to put together all of their financing that they need to go through the various steps to procure the financing, to be entitled, to get their permits, to get low-income housing tax credits. That can take some time. And so, our job here at Century is to really kind of step into that breach and give developers an acquisition loan, typically coupled with pre-development financing, so that they have the advantage of that a lot of other, market rate developers who can finance a project very quickly because they're not going after all these different government sources. Our loan product and our value proposition to the affordable housing community is that we allow affordable housing developers to take land off the market and to have a high LTV acquisition loan, and it's basically a bridge to give them the time they need to put together the financing and all that goes into building affordable housing in California. And so, that is what Century does. I was asked to give a real quick introduction about Century and then talk about some of the ways that I think we can hopefully all work together to increase the production of affordable housing. So just a little bit more about Century. So we were created, over 40 years ago as a state agency. When we're based in Culver City, we were traditionally based next door in Inglewood. But when the Century Freeway, the 105 freeway, was constructed, when they started that process in the 1970s, obviously the 105 freeway, which kind of, goes right from basically LAX east, cut through a number of low-income communities and destroyed a lot of affordable housing in the process of building that freeway. And this was sort of one of the last major freeways to be built in Los Angeles. And we were finally coming to terms with the fact that freeway construction has a very negative impact on communities and destroys affordable housing and divides communities in ways that we really wouldn't tolerate today. So what happened was the Century Freeway Housing Program was created through a lawsuit overseen by a judge named Harry Pragerson. And so the Century Freeway Housing Program was basically tasked with replacing that housing on a 2-to-1 basis, I believe. So after the freeway was completed and after the housing was rebuilt, and, after we met the consent decree, basically, the Century Freeway Housing Program was privatized into what we now call Century Housing. And so that happened about 25 years ago. And over the last 25 years, Century Housing has invested about $2.5 billion to developers to build affordable housing, helping to create tens of thousands of affordable units. And operations remain strong. We are very busy. We're one of the top CDFIs in the country, despite the fact that we only lend within California. And I would venture to say that we're one of the top lenders to affordable housing in this space. And we are as I mentioned, a CDFI, which is a community development finance institution, and we're basically a lending entity that is created to fill the gaps that traditional banks cannot fill because of their regulation. So we are an unregulated lender. We only finance affordable housing, and we can be creative and do things in such a way that a traditional bank can't do. And so we use that as, to our advantage to help create as much affordable housing as we can in providing higher LTV loans to both for-profit and nonprofit developers of affordable housing. And so, every year for the last, 7 years plus now, we've exceeded $200 million a year in loans for about, we do about 50 to 60 projects a year. We're based here in Southern California. We have an office up in the Bay Area, and so we really have extended our reach throughout the state since those early Century Freeway housing program days when we were just really concentrated along the Century Freeway corridor. So we're very proud of what we do. We have strong relationships with a number of affordable housing developers. We work very closely with small nonprofits all the way to large, very sophisticated nonprofit affordable housing developers. We also have a very strong and healthy client base of for-profit developers, all the way from developers of color that we're helping to incubate and create new opportunities for new developers to come into this space, all the way up to some of the larger for-profit affordable housing developers in the country who are active here in California. So that's a little bit about what Century does. One thing I'll just note very, very quickly is Century is unique. We're created to be a lender for affordable housing. We also have an affiliated real estate development operation which is also very active in developing affordable housing. They're based here in our corporate office. They do a lot of work in Long Beach. We're doing the Century Villages at Cabrillo, which is about a 900-unit campus. It's a former military base that we have been redeveloping over the last 20 years. We're also leading the effort to create over 1,000 units of permanent supportive housing on the West LA VA campus here in Southern California, right at the intersection of Wilshire and the 405. As many of you may know, there's a large development going on there. So Century is one of 2 developers active in developing that space. We're doing a large project down at a former housing authority property in San Pedro. So I don't represent that side of the business, but I say that because it just kind of gives you kind of a more kind of robust understanding of what we do here at Century. And also, you may have heard about us through some of our real estate development activities, and I wanted to be sure that, I covered that so that there wasn't any confusion. We're all one company. We just have 2 different divisions, lending and development.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. I apologize, but we have to keep moving. We've got some speakers that we need to bring on that are based out of New York. So I appreciate your contribution, Mr. Vasquez. Thank you for making sure that Mr. Hamilton was able to join us today. And to board proceedings, I just want to see if we could stick with the agenda. If people pop in, join us on the virtual environment, I'm willing to hear them, but we'll have to hear them after the folks that we have in queue. I'm trying to stay as close to time as possible.
Totally.
All right.
Totally.
Okay, Mr. Hamilton, if there are other remarks that you'd like to share with us, you're welcome to hang on till around 5 o'clock and and we can bring you back, but we're going to have to keep moving forward.
Good thing. All right. Well, thanks for your time.
You're
And
welcome.
I want to also thank Board Member Vasquez for the invitation. So thank you for bringing me on. I look forward to spending more time with all of you.
I hope so. We'll have more meetings in the future. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Ms. Cicchetti, could you please call, section 5?
Yes. The next item on today's Board Work Group agenda is item number 5, property tax abatement strategies, highlighting initiatives across the country and exploring successes, challenges, and lessons learned. The speakers today from the state of New York, New York City, Matthew Murphy, Executive Director, Forum Center, New York City University. Haley Reyes, Director, Data and Policy, Forum Center, New York University. Jessica Katz, Chief Housing Officer, City of New York. And Brendan McLaughlin, Deputy Commissioner for Policy and Strategy, City of New York, Department of Housing, Preservation and Development.
Great, thank you very much. So this is an interesting portion of our agenda where we are going to be talking about property tax abatement strategies, highlighting initiatives across the country and exploring success, challenges, and lessons learned. And so we have our guest today from New York City. Thank you for joining us in this meeting. You guys are almost, I'd say, the shining example of a city and a state that's doing it well. So please teach us. We are ready to hear from you on your presentation. I think first I have on my list Jessica Katz. Is she going to be joining us first?
My understanding is she's not.
Okay, what about, are you Matthew Murphy?
I'm Matthew Murphy.
And
yes.
then, is that you, Haley?
Hi, I'm Haley Rates.
Rates. Okay. Well, Mr. Murphy and Ms. Rates, let's see. We're going to hear from you first. Mr. Murphy is the executive director, and then Ms. Rates will hear from you as the director of data and policy. All right. Thank
Excellent.
you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and we'll be weaving in and out actually.
Oh, great.
For the presentation. So, thank you. My name is Matt Murphy. I'm the executive director of the NYU Furman Center. We're a joint research center between NYU's School of Law and our Graduate School of Public Service. We focus on issues related to land use, real estate, and urban policy. Formerly, I worked in New York City government, as well as at the city's Housing Finance Agency on affordable housing policy and property tax issues. I'm here with my colleague, Haley Rates, who's our Director of Data and Policy at the Furman Center. And today we've been asked to present background on New York State's 421A property tax benefit. It's a section of state law which allowed, and that past tense is going to be important, the use of a tax exemption in New York City's 5 boroughs that was aimed at increasing the supply of multifamily housing, as well as income restricted units in New York City. I'll hand it off to Haley to explain how the program works before talking through some of its criticisms and the findings of our recent research on units built under the program during the last decade. Finally, we'll explore the positive outcomes, challenges, and lessons learned from the program. Haley?
Great, thanks, Matt. So I'm going to start with a high-level introduction to 421A, although it is a complicated program, and so we're also going to try and discuss some of the details here today as well. And as a note, we're going to be taking questions after the presentation. So 421A is a tax exemption program that effectively lowers property taxes on new housing built in New York City. The program did sunset from law last month when it was not renewed by the New York State Legislature. However, existing properties that received the exemption prior to June 15th will continue to benefit from 421A, as will properties which had a foundation in the ground before June 15th, as long as they complete construction in the next few years. So, and it's also worth noting that 421A was originally passed by the New York State Legislature. So although the program is limited to New York City, the New York City Council did not have authority over program design. So I'm going to just break down how a tax exemption like 421A works, and we're going to compare a property with 421A to a property without 421A. One note first, in New York City, residential property is taxed differently based on the size of the property, whether it has fewer than 4 units or 4 or more units. So while this is complicated, essentially the multifamily housing, that 4 or more units, is taxed based on reported income and expenses, and then adjusted slightly based on factors such as location and other property characteristics. So here we have this property without 421A, and that's going to be taxed based on the Department of Finance's standard assessments of multifamily housing. So in contrast, a property with 421A is going to be fully assessed, but then the value of the new development is exempted, resulting in property taxes paid only on the land and any pre-existing buildings prior to the new development. The tax expenditure, or the property taxes that the city forgoes, is the difference between full property taxes and property taxes paid under 421A. So originally created in 1971, 421A was aimed at reviving New York City at a time of urban stagnation and disinvestment. By lowering the cost of building new housing, the program was intended to revitalize the city's market and kickstart new residential development. An early version of the program provided a 10-year exemption. Originally, 421A had no requirement to include affordable housing in new development. And as the market began to strengthen in the 1980s, the city began to carve geographic exclusion areas out of the program, starting with Manhattan and then moving to parts of the outer boroughs. The most recent version of 421A, known as Affordable New York, was passed into law by the legislature in the spring of 2017, after the previous version was allowed to sunset at the beginning of 2016. And then Affordable New York expired, as I mentioned, on June 15th of this year, following a contentious debate over the program. So the most recent version of 421A, also known as Affordable New York, has 7 options, and each of those options has unique requirements. So 6 of the Affordable New York options are for rental properties. So the exemption period for these rental options is 35 years, with the exemption dropping to the share of affordable units for the last 10 years for certain options. These rental options are distinguished by restrictions on other financing sources, property size and location, the share of units that are required to be income restricted, and the level of affordability required for those units. So for example, the commonly used option C prohibits the use of government subsidies and restricts development outside of Manhattan below 96th Street. Income restricted units under that option are affordable to middle income households. In addition, 421A includes a very restricted, rarely used ownership option for small condos and co-op properties built outside of Manhattan. The exemption period is set for 20 years, and the average assessed value for those units must be less than or equal to $65,000, which is going to roughly equate to a condo worth around $400,000 in the current market. So the most recent version of 421A included certain requirements and restrictions, including the following: market rate units in these buildings that exceeded the New York rent deregulation threshold at the time, which was $2,816 in 2021, either at time of initial lease up or during the exemption term, were no longer subject to rent regulation. Affordable units were required to either match the share of market rate units that were at each bedroom size in the property, or at least half of the affordable units had to have 2 or more bedrooms, and a maximum of a quarter of units could be studios. Only properties with 6 or more units were eligible for the program. The new building was required to include a new affordable unit for each residential unit existing on the site prior to construction. And then finally, projects with more than 300 units were subject to average hourly wage minimums for construction workers. So I'm going to hand it back to Matt.
Thank you, Haley. So I'm going to talk now about some of the criticisms of 421A. So 421A, throughout its history, has encountered substantial criticism, including in its most recent form as Affordable New York, the program name.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part. You said it's received some criticisms.
It got a new name, but we all still call it 421A.
Okay.
And the new name is Affordable New York. So
Okay.
just making clear that every round of 421A has been criticized, including when it got a new name. Critics argue that the program's costs simply outweigh the benefits. The tax expenditure, so the difference, as Haley mentioned, between assessed value and the actual taxes paid, was $1.7 billion in 2021. And that supports close to 200,000 units, only a portion of which are income restricted. So critics also argue that a substantial portion of units built under the most recent version of the program are affordable to middle-income households predominantly, rather than low-income households, earning as high as 130% of AMI. So in our region, that's about $140,000 for a family of 3. Finally, critics argue that there are more direct ways to encourage multifamily rental development in a comparatively high tax environment, including just reforming our property tax system more broadly, rather than kind of band-aiding it with 421A. There are counter-arguments to these. Others counter that the cost of the program is outweighed by the benefit because new units would just simply not be built, especially new rental units, without the exemption. In addition, some counter the criticism of subsidizing units affordable to middle-income households by arguing that deeper affordability would limit new development in middle markets especially, which undercuts one of the goals of the program to increase overall housing supply. Finally, proponents of 421A argue that improving the property tax system more broadly is not feasible, given long-standing political challenges to systemic reform. Put another way, in New York, we've been talking about property tax reform for 50 years, and we have not done it. So I'm going to talk, or Halia is now going to talk about our analysis of 421A in the last decade.
Right. So in a recent data brief that we put out, we explored what was built under 421A during the last decade. So we're looking at between 2010 and 2020, and during that time period, a variety of versions of the program were in place, including Affordable New York, which is the most recent version, which began in earnest in 2017, just to be clear. So as you can see here, 421A was responsible for the majority of new residential units among properties with 4 or more units built during this time period. For context on the program scale, in 2018, almost 5,000 units were built under other tax exemptions, which primarily support 100% income restricted housing, while close to 17,000 units were built under 421A. And here we've just grayed out data in recent years because we believe there are delays in the data on the use of exemptions like 421A. And in our focus chapter report this year, a separate report, we also estimated that between 2010 and 2020, a high number of income restricted units targeted to households earning 80% of AMI or less were constructed. So we estimate that more than 9,000 of those units were built in properties just solely benefiting from 421A. Close to 8,900 units were built in properties benefiting from both 421A and other government subsidies. And then a little over 34,000 units were built in properties benefiting solely from other government subsidies like LIHTC. So we also reviewed the average sub-borough area characteristics of income-restricted units built between 2010 and 2020. And we find that when examining units targeted to low-income households according to their type of subsidy, those receiving 421A only were built in neighborhoods with a lower poverty rate on average than units receiving other government subsidies. Research shows that low-income children who grow up in lower poverty neighborhoods fare better economically when they grow up. So this research highlights the value of building income-restricted units suitable for families in wealthier, better-resourced neighborhoods. Our data showed the opposite trend, however, among all units targeted to low-income households that were built between 2010 and 2020, including those units built under different programs than 421A. We found that studios and one-bedroom units were built in census tracts with higher incomes, higher rents, and lower poverty rates on average than larger units. So a common question about 421A, while it was still in place, was whether and how the current expenditures could be redirected to other programs. But because of their long-term structure, committed tax exemptions will continue to drive expenditures well into the future. So regardless of 421A sunsetting, the program will continue to be a central source of tax expenditures for the city as properties exemptions follow their benefit schedules and begin to phase out over time. So here we estimate 421A expenditures based on exemptions in place in 2021. According to that estimate, even though the program ended this year, we shouldn't expect to see a significant decline in expenditures for at least 10 years, and we will not see expenditures for the program completely end for 35 years, and that's the longest benefit period under the most recent version of the program. So I'll hand it back to Matt.
Thank you, and I will just close us out with kind of a review of the positive outcomes that we perceive, the challenges with the program, and then our lessons learned. And this is a mix of personal experience on the legislative and government side, as well as on the research side. So in terms of positive outcomes, many would argue that fortunately did open up new rental development, multifamily rental development opportunities in a comparatively high tax environment. In New York City, it is the case that new multifamily rental properties pay as much as 30% of their gross income towards property tax, which is just a very high rate. The new properties built under 428 do add to housing supply, many of which otherwise would not have been feasible or would have been built as an alternative use like a condo or a commercial development if they had the zoning, or a hotel. While these properties do not contribute taxes in the short run, in the long run, they do add to the city's tax base once the exemption wears off. In addition, 428 was effective at developing affordable units in higher income areas, as Haley just showed, especially when compared to other affordable housing programs more heavily government subsidized, like use of the low-income housing tax credit. Next, I'll talk about the challenges. New York's experience with 428 surfaced a number of challenges in designing and implementing such a program. The program sunset in June of this year reflects the challenge of unpredictability for the marketplace, especially based on the political cycle for a program that sunsets every handful of years from law. In addition, the program had to balance affordability, market conditions, and land costs. Some argue that a portion of the subsidy provided via the tax exemption was offset by a subsequent increase in land costs, undercutting the effectiveness of the program, or put another way, the subsidy was being mostly captured by existing landowners. It is challenging to design a program where market conditions vary widely. For example, do you draw lines that have an affordable housing requirement within them because they are a strong market, but not outside of them because it is a weaker market? It has been New York City's experience in the last 20 years that because markets can change quickly, this is a very complicated exercise in practice. The designers of the program also had to weigh the depth of affordability and share of income restricted units required against ensuring that the cost of restricted units can be effectively subsidized by market prices. That is, markets will pencil out or be financially feasible. Finally, it is challenging to design the size of the benefit, including how long it lasts. Subsidy is particularly valuable at the beginning of the project because it attracts financing, but it can be difficult to determine how long the subsidy needs to be to stimulate development in general, and B, to support the operating costs of the affordable units, knowing the goal is to keep those units affordable in perpetuity. And then just in terms of lessons learned from the program, policymakers have a number of considerations. The reality is there are a number of political considerations when designing such a program, including on the affordability side, the tenant protection side, as well as the labor and construction side. Fair housing considerations are key. For example, policymakers should anticipate and mitigate against any issues that reinforce segregated living patterns or give the appearance of violating the Fair Housing Act. For example, a controversy in New York City recently was the Poor Door, a separate entrance for income restricted units, or in a past form of the program, developers were allowed to place income restricted units off-site, in some cases even in another borough. Without proper zoning, no exemption can unlock new multifamily housing. Policymakers should understand how a tax exemption like 421A must be partnered with zoning reforms where needed, or ensure in general that the zoning is there. Policymakers should consider how local inclusionary housing programs can work in tandem with the property tax exemption. That is, not double subsidizing or double dipping, or ensuring that the programs align. And given the importance of opening up neighborhood resources to children in particular, policymakers should put in consideration into unit size requirements, such as the number of bedrooms or the income or for the income restricted units. In addition, they should consider enforcement mechanisms for any rent stabilization that's put onto the units, as is the case in New York City. And finally, policymakers should consider building in flexibility to adapt to a changing environment while also providing program clarity to the market. And with that, we will conclude and be happy to answer any questions. We have just discussed two of the most complicated issues that I'm aware of in New York City. One is property taxes in general, and two is the 421A program. So I appreciate your patience as we went through it.
Actually, thank you very much, Mr. Murphy and Mrs. Rates. We appreciate your candor. And I'm curious, when you were saying that the 421A program had criticism, who is criticizing?
The criticisms come from a number of places. I mean, in general, we attribute to a general sentiment of the criticism that new housing supply does actually reduce costs. Mm-hmm. So what we call supply skepticism. 421A becomes a poster child because it's not just that it's building new housing, it's also that it's government subsidizing the building of that new housing in the form of tax expenditure. Another criticism is from I guess I would call advocates of low-income housing, where making the point that 421A in its current design didn't serve households that had, low incomes. That was a combination of middle incomes, low incomes, extremely low incomes, but the way the program was actually used, it wasn't leading to creation of a significant amount of low-income housing. Those are some of the major criticism, and then you get the criticism of just the idea of subsidizing, real estate development, and that it's captured by landowners. So all the kind of typical considerations and conversation around housing affordability that come up. 421A is kind of on steroids, as I would say.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. We're going to keep moving, and we'll circle back to you for questions if you wouldn't mind. Actually, let me pivot. Colleagues, do you have questions? Yes, Senator Gaines has a question for you. Just keeping in mind you're 3 hours ahead of us, so you probably don't want to hang out with us very much longer. So let's go ahead and get our questions out. Okay, go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for showing both the pros and the cons. I really appreciate that in terms of the challenges that you've had to deal with. But could you just expand a little bit on, in the event of the absence of 421A, would you just have market housing and there would not be an answer to affordable? I mean, what would that look like? What would New York City look like without a program such as this?
That's a phenomenal question, and folks are speculating about it. What we have theorized is that there's a few kind of lines of logic. The first is you could assume that it will come back, that the politics around it will make it so that because our supply constraints, unless we reform property taxes, that they will have to come and do something because our tax rate is just so high on new multifamily development. But let's say it never comes back. Then a few kind of possible outcomes. The first is a lot of development shifts to condominium. 421A was changed. In prior versions of the program, we had as of right allowance of condominiums receiving the benefit, and had some, pretty both middle class but also egregious examples of very high-end condos receiving the benefit. The law changed and took condos out. you could see a world in which there's no 421A, there's less competition with condo development. We subsidize home ownership in other ways across all levels of government. And as a result, you would see more market rate condominium development. And some of the issues there are just that condos are significantly larger, so it's just less households housed, and obviously are expensive as well. The other, but at the same time, they would be contributing full taxes. The other line of logic is that because we don't rely, we kind of glanced past this, but it's an important point. New York State allows affordable housing development to use other tax exemptions. So 421A would get layered with tax exempt bonds or low-income housing tax credits. But because we have others, we expect that the government subsidized, the more heavily subsidized, that is, local funding, low-income housing tax credits, will all go forward kind of at the same scale as it had without 421A. The issue, though, is that in New York City, those are cited, as Haley pointed out, in very different kinds of neighborhoods than where the market was building. So the expectation would be you would just get far less low-income housing built in our very strongest markets. So those are the lines of logic. And then the final is that, well, if it is a land subsidy, then land costs will adjust down. And then they'll get down to a point where, it makes development feasible. And the problem with that line of logic is most of our land has some form of alternative use. And in this case, especially the condominium use would be the baseline. So it all involves a complicated array of market conditions, et cetera. But in general, we expect to see less overall units developed, a changing composition of units developed, far more towards condominium, and then a question about whether and how the kind of local land prices adapt.
And so it'd be more affordable, market affordable units versus low and very low?
Yeah, right now we don't have a program that tells the market or asks the market, incentivizes the market to build affordable housing along with their market rate housing in the absence of 421A.
Okay, very good.
Question for you.
Thank you.
I just want to acknowledge that the state of California is just starting down this path to consider property tax abatements to incentivize housing development. What top three recommendations would you suggest that California contemplate as we go through this process?
It's a phenomenal question, and I think I have so much respect for you guys for taking this on, because it's fundamentally a tool to address supply issues and supply constraints, and that it is just the case that here we have a lot of supply constraints, but we have also built a good amount of housing, per capita not as much as we need to, and in general not as much as we need to. And it will be a big question about what happens going forward. But I also think a big difference in our politics here is that designing a program that is a market rate incentive or an incentive to build new housing that includes low-income housing, affordable housing today versus dealing with a program that was created 50 years ago and has kind of evolved every 5 years, I think is maybe, I don't want to say maybe, I want to be definitive about it, but I think it's a better exercise because you can mitigate some of these concerns. So the first is, I think, a cost-benefit analysis of different types of markets would be really helpful. And by that, I mean, what is it you're getting in terms of affordability over the long run versus what are you giving up in the form of a property tax expenditure? And the hope being that you will benefit more in the long run. And that's without even considering just the price relief that comes from supply, just from the affordable standpoint. I think that's a really important exercise. The second is, I would simplify it to be like, well, what are you trying to address? And if it is an overall supply issue and you just need emergency kind of market rate housing, then you might sacrifice on the affordability side, but also give less of a benefit. if it's more about, well, it's that, and also we want all new housing to include a portion of affordable housing, then that's a question of program design and how much property tax expenditure and how long, are you kind of willing to allow that to go? And that can just be an incredibly powerful tool, a mixed income new housing development tool. And then the third, and I think it's critical, and we got to see some of the prior presentation, is what do you do about home ownership? I think it's a really important thought exercise to go through, because New York City, and I was a part of this, we reformed it to move away from home ownership. The idea being like, why are we subsidizing like high cost condos? But depending on where you are, I just think it's probably a really critical question to think about, whether and how that fits in, because it's helpful to homeowners. It gives them, incentive, but at the same time, it's the same question of who's capturing that subsidy, and then who's kind of left holding the bag when the exemption wears off. So those are, some three big ones, but I do think it comes down to kind of underwriting exercises and balancing financial feasibility, and then thinking about how do you allow the program to adapt, and where do you allow the program, and in what form, and in what types of buildings. It sounds like a lot. It's
It does
New
sound like a
York,
lot,
it's a
Mr. Murphy.
108-page law.
Let me jump in, just because we're
Yeah.
pressed for time, but I want to get my second question in. Are you able to provide some insight about the future of property tax abatement in New York?
Right
Like
now,
Miss
we
Miss
don't
Reitz
have-
knows something. I saw her facial gestures. Don't hold back. So, I mean, clearly the data shows success, but the law just sunset, so I imagine there's some politics involved.
There's big time politics involved. The reality is we just don't know. Actually, I'll you kind of said, wow, you guys are doing really well. I'll say, we flip it here. People here are talking about how did California do their land use reforms, and a long kind of process. Like, we're actually behind as a state what California has done. And so here, I think more of the conversation is flipping to the supply constraint being our regional restrictions on new development in the form of land use. Whereas there, I consider it kind of a natural follow-up to what has happened, because that you have the zoning, now you need the capital, you need the builders, and property taxes are a barrier to building. And so that's just kind of the reality. So here, though, we expect it to come back in some form, a program that has more affordability, a lower tax benefit schedule, but still makes rental competitive with condominiums. And we kind of need it because the inclusionary housing programs that we've passed will only work, or will work best when it's coupled with a 420 exemption, and the market has the tax side, the zoning side, but also is providing affordability, and we expect to see more conversation about that.
Okay. All right. I'm afraid we are out of time. We've got one last question from my colleague, Mr. Schaefer.
Oh, well, Mr. Murphy, I just wanted to thank you for all your input. I feel we're fortunate to have a executive with the responsibilities you do share with us. If you are a day employee, I want to take judicial notice that it's after 6 o'clock there, and you should get time and a half. And I want to tell you that 64 years ago, I was a student at NYU at Washington Square and Summer in Greenwich Village. At 84, I'm the oldest California constitutional officer, and I'm excited to see what we're all doing and that we can be coast to coast. And thank you again.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. We appreciate
Thank
you
you.
sharing
Good
your
luck.
wisdom and experience with us.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you soon.
Wait,
So
one more
long.
question. Hold on. Hold on.
One real quick question. Did I hear you mention earlier when you were saying that, now that this thing is sunset, unlike here in California, we have inclusionary housing? You don't have inclusionary housing in development, or do you?
Oh, no, we do. Sorry. I just meant that we have two forms of inclusionary housing, mandatory and voluntary, and both will only work best with a market tax exemption like 421A in place, rather than a discretionary one, which is what we only have right now.
Got it, okay.
All right, we thank you very much. Okay, we're
Thank
going to
you.
have to move on. Mr.
Okay.
Ketty, could you please call speakers from the state of Washington?
From the state of Washington, I'd be happy to. Speakers from the state of Washington, Seattle. Micaiah Winkler, Director, City of Seattle, Office of Housing, and Jennifer Labreck, Manager, Marketing Incentives, Land Use and Sustainability Manager, City of Seattle, Office of Housing.
All right, thank you very much. I believe they're joining us virtually.
I don't see them on.
Okay. Well, let's go to the JPA portion of our discussion then. So that's
Okay.
6.
Item 6.
Yes.
The next item on today's Board Work Group agenda is item 6, Understanding California's Experience, Highlighting Local Government Use of Joint Powers Authorities, Welfare Exemptions, and Other Strategies to Increase the Availability of Affordable Housing. The speakers will be in 3 separate groups. The first group is John P. Stockler and Ben Barker. Both of them are financial advisors with the California Municipal Finance Authority.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. John Stoker with the California Municipal Finance Authority. Thank you, and thank you to the entire board. Super excited about speaking on middle-income housing. We've got a program that goes by many names. Some people refer it to as middle-income housing, other workforce housing, and some essential housing.
Okay.
It really goes back to, back in World War I was the first time workforce housing was tried. And then it's kind of appropriate that New York just went. This California program was really went off of a program that was started in New York about 50 years ago using a property tax abatement to effectuate the program. And California has started with that model and updated it to serve Californians. And so we are very excited about what this has offered. It's really been meaningful to change the lives of the missing middle, to help them, especially in today's high inflation environment. Now, as you discussed at the very beginning, folks that are making market rate can afford to buy market rate apartments that, they've got plenty of income, and folks that are in the lower income spectrum, there are multiple affordable housing programs, but the people in between there, what we refer to 61% AMI to 100% AMI of area median income, those are the missing middle. And that's the folks that we are working to fix. And these workers are the people that are critical to California's communities and critical to our economy. And they're the people that provide our education, our health care, our public safety and services. Now, the middle income program, as we talked about, it fills the gap of affordable and market rate, and it does this at a lower cost with a lower subsidy than most of our affordable housing programs. For example, the tax credit programs usually subsidize their projects anywhere from 30 to 70%. The only subsidy we have is the property tax abatement, and that is done on purpose so that we don't compete with the other affordable housing programs that that could use every piece of subsidy that they've got. So as we talked about, the property tax exemption is what enables the program, but the key differentiator of this middle income program or workforce housing program, essential housing program, is government ownership. Local governments, through joint powers authorities, own these assets. And so that ownership provides a number of benefits. The biggest is that besides providing affordability right now to middle income residents, all of the equity, all of the appreciation of the asset goes to local government, and the residents enjoy that, as opposed to with most of the other programs that we have in the state. Private entities ultimately enjoy the asset and enjoy all that appreciation. So government ownership versus private development, big benefit. Now, how exactly the middle income program works is that the joint powers authorities either purchase a current market rate unit or project, or we finance the building of new construction to fix the missing middle. On the cases where we purchase an existing project, we purchase that asset. It goes from private ownership to public ownership, and because of that, when you have governmental ownership, it comes off the property tax rolls. And so with that incentive, we are able to reduce the rents to the middle-income residents. And this program fills the need for folks between 61% AMI and 120% AMI programmatically, although that we can fit the needs of certain cities, and we have customized this. But as you're all aware, I'm sure, per HUD definition, below 80% AMI, the 61 to 80% still qualifies for low income for affordable. So there are meaningful reductions to residents that are staying here. Well, programmatically, there is no displacement of existing residents, and so we don't, no one is kicked out because of this. As part of the purchase and part of the program, just like with affordable housing projects, we put a regulatory agreement on the property to ensure that the affordability requirements stay there and serve the residents that live there, and the city makes sure that the project is covered, and we are doing what we say we're going to do. Now, this program has created $8 billion of private investment into California, and we've been able to create over 13,500 middle-income units to the tune of roughly 50 different projects. And these projects go from new construction, Class A type projects, to older value-add projects that require a fair amount of rehabilitation. Now, there are folks that are concerned about the property tax loss, and yes, that's meaningful. We think it's a great investment to provide middle-income housing, but I think it's important to look at that it's not a loss like you may see in other affordable housing projects. It's more of a deferral, and more importantly, it's an investment in the future, because all of the appreciation that benefits local government and the residents there because of the governmental ownership. If you look back at any 15-year period in the last 45 years, I think you would see that this $8 billion investment should multiply all to the benefit of local government. So once again, local government control of the project. The local governments, through a public benefit agreement, they control the asset. They control what happens to the asset if it stays in the middle income program. If they want to sell it, or after the bonds are paid off, what we're hearing from most municipalities is that they are wanting to, since all the bonds are paid off, they have an asset free and clear. They intend to use that as an affordable asset, and they can end up having deeply affordable units because there's nothing on, no debt on the project. And so, big difference between government ownership and where a private asset will roll off and benefit ultimately an individual. Now,
Real quick,
I was actually,
Mr. Stalker, I just want to remind you that you got Mr. Ben Barker also, who's here with us in the chamber today. So I want to make sure that he has an opportunity to share a couple of his thoughts too.
Yes, ma'am. And I was just on my last sentence.
Oh, okay,
I appreciate
okay,
it.
all right, just checking. Go ahead, wrap it up.
I am so sorry. So thank you very much. We appreciate the opportunity to work with you and the board to continue to provide solutions to Californians. Thank you.
Oh, that was a nice last sentence. I'm sorry I interrupted you. I appreciate that. Okay, so here we have in the chamber today, we've got Ben Barker, who you know, but we also have Sean Ralston from Waterford Property Company. It's good to see you both today in real time. Mr. Barker, do you have any comments? And then Mr. Ralston will follow up and close out with you, okay?
Yeah, I have a few comments. I could reiterate John's last sentence, but
Okay.
but I'll just start. So I'm usually pretty good off the cuff, but I did make a few notes. My name is Ben Barker. I'm with the financial advisor to the California Municipal Finance Authority. I've spent my entire career financing housing. So I've from doing $20 billion in mortgage-backed securities to spending the last 15 years of issuing bonds for affordable housing projects, roughly doing 60-plus affordable housing projects per year. I'd just like to state that I grew up in affordable housing. I lived in a 1,000-square-foot project with my 5 brothers and my mother. Half my family is still on welfare, and so affordable housing is something, that means something to me, and that's why I've chosen to stay in this career. So kind of going on and iterating what John went over, I do feel lucky that I'm able to advise the CMFA. To date, the CMFA has issued over 550 affordable housing projects for low-income housing projects. The CMFA currently has close to 100 affordable housing project applications that are going into SIDLAC this year. Unfortunately, we are limited by bond allocation, and maybe only 30 to 40 of those will be lucky enough to be financed through the Bond Allocation and Tax Credit Committee. I do believe that the other bond issuers, as well as myself, we have enough in our pipelines that we could take all of the bond allocation this year as well as next year, and then maybe into the following year. So we're in a spot where there's obviously not enough bond allocation, and we're not going to be able to get all the affordable housing projects financed that we want to. So the CMFA a few years ago started looking for other opportunities to finance affordable housing. What could we do to create affordable units? So we did a deep dive into the middle income housing program that John just outlined, and we came to the conclusion that the public benefit was really there. The public benefit in this program, I like to view it as transition housing. So in the state of California, we have those deeply discounted affordable units, and then we have really expensive, but there's nothing in between, and that's why we keep seeing the missing middle income. We've seen it in articles, we've seen it everywhere, that there's this missing middle. And if you've ever taken a tour of an affordable housing project, you would notice they're really nice projects. And for somebody to leave an affordable housing project and move into a market rate project, they're not getting anywhere near the type of housing that they deserve or need, and there's no incentive for them to leave. They're going to stay there forever, and that's why we see statistically that people don't transition out of affordable housing. So we're stuck in this cycle of always needing to create more because we don't transition anybody out. So John briefly outlined that this middle-income housing program has different affordability buckets, starting at 60% AMI, going to 80% AMI, then 80 to 100, then 100 to 120. So I really view this program as a transition out of the deeply discounted affordable into middle income. Macro or microeconomics have shown recently that if people are living around higher wage income earners, they move up the economic ladder. SIDLAC and TCAC have recently changed their regulations over the past 2 years, and instead of just continually flooding a very low income area with affordable housing, they're incentivized to put new affordable projects into more affluent areas. They want to get these people mixed in with more affluent people, and they can work their way up through the ladder. But in our current system, we don't do that. And we don't really have any of the groups that you would think would be out advocating for the affordable housing to advocate them to move on and transition out. So unfortunately, there's been, and I think John did hit, we think that this program has been a smashing success. The middle income housing projects, first, do not rely on any federal, state, or local funding. We don't ask for grants or any subsidies in that manner. It's purely through the tax abatement that we're able to finance these programs. And so the interesting thing, there's been 51 projects financed, 13,500 plus units created over the last 3 years. And on average, it's about $443,000 per door to finance, as opposed to maybe the LIHTC program that can range $600,000 to $1.1 million per door that we've seen in San Francisco lately. So first, we're not asking for money. We're not asking for grants. We're not taking anything from the low-income housing projects, and we're getting a better cost per door. And John Penkower is going to go into more statistics later about the turnover and the public benefit that's been provided. Unfortunately, there have been some articles, I think everybody's seen those, about and papers produced about middle-income housing. Obviously, AB 1850 was just struck down. There was zero middle ground between the authors and the people that are actually creating the affordable housing. Really, the advocates had said that they'd like to put guardrails on the projects, and they proposed legislation. We all went through the 51 projects that the legislation would have been approved. Zero of these projects would have been done. So we would have created zero middle-income housing projects with the proposed legislation. Again, we're more than willing to work with the legislators and to work through and get good legislation in place. It's just the current legislation that was killed wouldn't provide any affordable housing. And just to kind of go, there's been some other statements that are out there that talk about the middle-income housing. People have used the phrase, it's a discounted Ferrari. We've worked pretty tirelessly to kind of go through and work with the market and work with advocates and on both sides of the aisle of this, and there's a lot of terms that have been thrown out, discounted Ferrari. Again, half the projects that have been created have been 80s and 90s stock housing with hundreds of millions of dollars put back into the rehab of those projects. So these are not all brand-new units, brand-new projects that are just lining the pockets of somebody. I have a lot of examples of projects that we looked at. CMFA, unfortunately, we're dealing with market rate sellers and we're competing against market rate buyers. If it takes us a year to go through the process with the city and having to explain newspaper articles and other reports and things like that, you can't compete. We looked at a project where we would reduce day one $1,000 per door. The process took about a year to get through the city, and once we were approved, the seller just decided, I'm done with it. They flipped the project, they sold it for $34 million more than what CMFA had it in contract, and raised the price per unit $1,400 per door. So there's a $2,400 swing in the rent, in what could have been the rents for those projects. But I do believe in this program. I believe it provides vast public benefit. The market is correcting itself right now, the bond market and the purchasers. And so the program is continually improving. We're hoping the bond market comes back a little bit later this year and that we can start working on some more of these projects. And the next two speakers will be able to go into deep detail about actual specific projects as well as the statistics of the great things that have been provided. And with that, I'd like to turn my time over to John Penkower.
Great, thank you. So the next speakers, colleagues, we're going to hear from Mrs. John Penkower and also Sean Robson. So I think John's going to go first.
John's going to go first.
All right,
Thank
then
you.
we'll hear from Sean.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Hi, John.
Hi there. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, board members. John Penkower. Thank you for including us in today's discussion. I apologize for not being there in person, but I've been watching all day and pretty amazed by the many creative ideas that we all need to create more affordable housing throughout the state. I'm with CSCDA, the California Statewide Communities Development Authority. Much like our friends at CMFA, we are a joint powers authority created back in the 1980s by the League of Cities and CSAC to provide financing tools for cities and counties. We represent 530 city and county members and have issued $70 billion in bonds for a variety of different types of projects, infrastructure financing. We issue new markets tax credits for investment in low-income census tracts. And again, similarly to CMFA, we finance a lot of traditional multifamily low-income housing. We have about 800 projects in our portfolio for about 90,000 units of traditional affordable housing that have been created with 4% tax credits. We similarly got involved in the Essential Housing Program a couple years ago after realizing that none of the current subsidies are available to those earning above that 60 to 80% AMI demographic. Even when CIDLAC and TCAC were not oversubscribed like they are today, we had about 13 years of having plentiful tax credits and bonds. They still wouldn't be available to help alleviate rents for those earning a middle income. So we got involved 2 years ago. We have acquired and financed 30 projects for 7,700 units throughout the state. Again, we did so because we were and remain unaware of any other programs out there that are able to significantly and immediately reduce rents for those in the middle income, moderate income demographic. This is our workforce. These are teachers, firefighters, public safety officers. We hear stories every day of city and county employees moving into properties, those tenants that were headed out of state, many of them, because they couldn't afford to live in California anymore, and that they're able to stay and continue working in the communities where they were previously living. I'm going to try not to repeat anything that's been said by John and Ben so far, but there are some important details that I think you should be aware of about the program. This is an optional tool. It's a voluntary program. For a lot of cities, it made sense over the last couple years, and some looked at it and it didn't make sense for them. Most cities go through a pretty rigorous evaluation process. It can take months, multiple trips to city council, outside consultants, outside counsel. That makes it challenging when we're competing for market rate properties, where you have an alternative cash buyer that can close in 10 or 15 days. We looked at the demographic of the properties that were acquired, and I heard today, I think 2 or 3 times, the term rent burdened, and many of Californians are rent burdened. Most of our properties, 30 to 40% of the residents living there, they already qualified, meaning they would immediately receive rent discounts under the program, and it also meant that they were rent burdened. They were paying more than 50% of their income towards rent. Another important consideration is that under current law, none of these acquisitions qualify for RENA credit. And so the cities that are participating and foregoing property taxes, they're not doing it to meet any of their state goals. They're doing it simply to alleviate the rent burden on their residents. I mentioned that there was 30 projects under the CSCDA program. There's 51 in total. And what's really important is, what are the outcomes? And we evaluate this on a weekly and monthly basis. Where are the rents? How many units have been converted? How does that compare to the property taxes that the properties are exempt from? And we're seeing outcomes that we did not anticipate. We initially looked at approximately a 10% rental savings across the board with all income groups, and we're seeing the rental savings in the 20 to 30% range in a very short period of time. So the early project that closed in the beginning part of last year, so we're about 18 months in, we've converted 50 to 60% of those units already. And we're seeing rental savings in the $500 to $800 range. And for those that are in that low income, 60 to 80% group, the rental savings are $1,000 or more. These are really meaningful savings. This is not a slight discount on a Ferrari. And those rental savings will continue to grow over time with the rent caps, rent increase caps that are in place. So a question that comes up pretty frequently is, well, how is the program able to be so successful in a short period of time, acquire that many properties, and then why are the rental savings so significant? Timing, timing, timing. We were able to capitalize on historically low interest rates in the 3 and 3.5% range that unfortunately they're gone now, and it is very challenging to finance these projects today because interest rates are about 2 to 2.5% higher. That combined with the market rate growth that we've seen is providing additional savings to those residents that are living in these properties. For instance, multifamily rents in Orange County last year were up 10%. In San Diego, 12.7%. In San Jose, they're up 11%. And rents statewide are expected to increase 13.8% in the next 12 months. It's a supply and demand issue. Statewide vacancy rate remains at 3.5%, and we just don't have enough units, and that's what's leading to this drastic increase in market rents. We also look at the property tax savings, or the savings versus property taxes, which is most important, I think, of interest to all of you that comprise this board. The rental savings, so of our 30 properties, we're calculating that today at $52 million annually, and the exempt property taxes are about $24 million. So you're already seeing a 2-to-1 ratio in public benefit that's derived from the program, and that's going to grow and continue to grow as these assets remain in the program. I'm now going to transition over to Sean, who's going to talk more specifically about 2 important case studies, and then remain available for questions. And again, thank you so much for including us in this important discussion today.
Thank you, and welcome, Sean Rawson. You're next.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. I have prepared remarks, but a lot of what I think I was planning on saying has been said by John, Stoker, John Penkower, and Ben Barker. So I'm going to truncate my remarks and then talk from a practitioner's point of view. But I'm Sean Rawson, the co-founder of Waterford Property Company. Waterford is a mission-driven company that specializes in the production of market-rate, mixed-income, and affordable housing in California. Since 2020, Waterford has been California's most active sponsor in the JPA Middle-Income Workforce Housing Program, having been a part of 2.4 million of bond issuances with CSCDA and having acquired just over 4,000 units in California. As a practitioner that specializes in the production of traditional affordable housing, market rate housing, and middle income housing, one of the things that I really want to highlight today is just how innovative and how powerful this financing tool has been. As someone that competes for tax credits at the state level for both state and federal housing tax credits, and then tries to get volume cap, or essentially the ability to issue private placement bonds for traditional LIHTC tax credit projects, we're used to a very competitive project that is overprescribed. Typically, California issues about $3.5 billion of private activity bonds for affordable housing. And in the context of this program, we've issued over $8 billion of bonds in 2 years to income restrict over 13,000 units. One of the points I want to make is that the bonds that we've issued for this program do not compete for traditional affordable housing sources. So this is an additive financing source to California that didn't exist 2 years ago. One of the other unique aspects of this program, as Ben mentioned in his remarks, is that in addition to the investment, we've brought a whole new series of investors to affordable housing in California. The investors in these projects are municipal bond investors, so they're typically investors that would buy muni bonds, so either city, housing authority, what have you, and invest in public infrastructure. Now we've captured those investors, which prior to this program were not investing in California affordable housing, and now they're part of this program. And so I want to continue to highlight how powerful that is, because in a time where, as we've all heard today, that we're in a housing crisis here in California, the more investment that we can get into affordable housing in our state, that's a key thing. Before I close my remarks, one of the things I just want to highlight too is some of the successes of our portfolio with over 4,000 units, so about 30% of the units in the program. We are daily seeing real-time data of this program. Before I touch on that, there have been critics of the program, as Ben mentioned, and so I'm not going to touch on all of that, but I think the key thing here today is to analyze, or to more to the point, quantify the public benefits. So essentially, we're getting a property tax abatement in return for public benefit. And what is that public benefit? That's affordable housing. And what's unique about this program, as John Stoker mentioned in his comments, is that unlike a traditional affordable housing project that gets a tax abatement, but none of that revenue flows back to the local government, in this instance, all of the revenue, once the bonds are paid off, flows back to the local government. So if you were to quantify that, and if you were to look at the tax abatement, it's about a 10x return for the local governments once the bonds are paid off. But that said, one of the things I want to just touch on is the quantifying aspects of our portfolio. Since January of 2020, Waterford has acquired, as I mentioned, 4,014 market rate units and converted them to income restricted essential housing units. The weighted average rental discount to market across our portfolio is 24%, and the current rental savings across our entire portfolio is $35,323,000, which equates to $8,800 annually per household of our renters. Critics, as I mentioned, like to state that the public benefits are yet to be determined. My response to this is please speak to the 7,000 residents living in our communities and ask them what they think. To show our tenants' stories, we have recorded numerous tenant testimonials espousing their support of the program, which has been sent to BOE staff. Let's see. I'm going to touch on two quick success stories, two case studies, and I'll be brief. In March of last year, we acquired a project called 777 Place in the city of Pomona. It was a 1980s vintage asset, 472 units. 20% of the units had an income restriction at very low, so 50% AMI. They had a reg agreement that was set to expire. We were able to issue bonds to acquire the asset, extend the regulatory agreement out an additional 35 years, and then we took the 20% of very low and actually increased that to a third of the units, and the additional market rate units we made income restricted. So now the entire project is income restricted. 33% of the units are at 50% AMI. We are investing $20 million in capital expenditures to the project, and the weighted average rents in the first year have gone down 15%. So that shows you the success that we're having. The other quick story I wanted to mention is we acquired an asset in the city of Long Beach called Ocean Air, across from the new Civic Center, 216-unit project. Since acquiring that asset in last year, we have converted 70% of the units. We have discounted the rents 21% from when we acquired the asset. And if you look at the demographics of that project, what's so powerful is we are hitting all the tiers of the missing middle. The city had done a study showing that 80% of the new tenants in downtown Long Beach that were renting new projects or new construction build projects in the city were moving from out of area, or more to the point, from out of the city. If you look at our project, Ocean Air, we have flipped that on its head. Now, 80% of all the tenants in our project have moved into our project from the city of Long Beach. And if you look at the tenant profile of those demographics, we've got Long Beach City employees, Long Beach police and fire workers, members of labor such as La Luna, SEIU, Long Beach School District teachers, multiple nonprofit employees, LA County employees and sheriffs, Long Beach Memorial employees, social workers, hospitality workers, and numerous essential workers. So in closing, because I know that I don't want to take up too much time, I just want to say we really appreciate you having us as part of today's agenda. As a practitioner that specializes in affordable housing, this is a program that I can't tell you how successful it has been. We're committed to continuing to make it better. But to Ben's point, there was legislation that was proposed. We successfully worked to essentially eliminate that. But that said, we're committed to working with stakeholders, and I think that this is just shows you if innovation is allowed to be part of this process, there really is success stories for how we can tackle California's housing crisis. So thank you for allowing me to be here today, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Vasquez.
Just one quick one. Can you kind of walk me through you said you're able to float bonds. Are these private or are these voted on bonds?
So these are governmental revenue bonds, and essentially by partnering with the Joint Powers Authority, so a CMFA or a CSCDA, we're essentially allowed to acquire the asset in a government-owned structure via the JPA, which allows us to issue governmental bonds, so essentially muni bonds. And that's what qualifies the asset for the tax exemption, and in addition allows us to sell those bonds under a muni structure, so no different that a city would do or a local government.
But unlike some construction bonds where you have to go before the voters, you just have a joint powers between the city. Is that what it is?
Correct. We get a discretionary approval from the local jurisdiction, as John Penkower mentioned. So for instance, our company, we went through 15 discretionary approvals last year, or actually in the last 2 years, through multiple cities. And typically it's a 3 to 4 hearing process, and it's working with consultants and with the local stakeholders.
And who sets the limit on those bonds? Is it based on the assets?
It's based on the underwriting.
Because that's
of the
your
asset.
collateral, right?
Correct. Correct.
Got it.
All right, thank you. This is actually really helpful and very informative. Mr. Applewhite, do you have a question? Please.
What is the source of the bonds that you were referring to earlier?
The LIHTC and the tax credits and bond allocation.
Yes.
So the state through the federal government gets an allotment of bond allocation every year, and that's through the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee.
Okay.
The IRS allots a multiplier and says this is how much the state can issue in affordable housing bonds. And so it's roughly $4.3-ish billion of deals that can be done per year in the very low-income housing structure. So from there, what happens is it's not actually the state issuing the bonds or anybody issuing the bonds. It's the developer goes and gets a private mortgage, which is actually a private activity bond, and only $4.3 million of those mortgages can be done per year.
Okay.
And so, unfortunately, us and a lot of the other issuers, there's probably close to $1 billion worth of deals that would like to move forward, but we're limited by that state ceiling cap on how many deals can be done per year.
Okay, thank you.
Just, if you wouldn't, I've got one anecdotal story that'll take 30 seconds. So we have a project in the city of Irvine that's a low and very low income project. We're in partnership with the city of Irvine. It's for a 100 senior unit project with city subsidy. I think we're going on our 4th round of trying to get bond allocation, which is typical because of the impact. Essentially, there's so many projects trying to get allocation right now that it can take. To give you context, we bought the land on that project in January of 2020. It's shovel ready, and we still have yet to get bond allocation. We're hopeful in the next round, but that's just, it shows you how difficult it is to build affordable housing in our state.
And while I'm very empathetic to the developers in that scenario, I mean, we've heard a lot about that the process needs to be streamlined, things need to be done. It really isn't as much of a matter of streamlining as it's just the demand is so outrageous that there's just not the allocation to do the projects.
Yeah.
And so projects apply multiple times, but there's not the allocation to do the projects. It's as simple as the IRS tax code says no. And so it is frustrating for developers to try to produce low-income housing projects, but there's not the bond allocation that will allow them to do that.
All right, let me jump in here and pivot. We still have to hear from our other teammates, Mr. Michael Lane from Spur, and then also Mr. David Garcia from the Policy Director from the Turner Center of Housing and Innovation. And you might recall, colleagues, that we heard from the founder and executive director earlier. Ben and Sean, thank you so much for your presentation. Why don't you gentlemen go ahead and get started? Well, David, Mr. Garcia, we'll start with you.
Certainly. Thank you, Chair, members of the board.
I think we do have a PowerPoint.
Oh, yes, if you could pull that up, that'll help
All right,
that,
we'll cue that
conversation.
PowerPoint up.
Thank you. We're actually going to split up our presentation into 2 segments. I'm going to speak about our recent work on the JPA model, and then my colleague, Mr. Lane, is going to talk about a specific property tax proposal that Spur has been developing. So first, Chair, you mentioned our esteemed founder, Carol Galante, earlier. It was really wonderful to have her here and to see the engagement of the board with her on not just this specific topic, but also just in affordable housing and housing in general. Because a lot of the ideas that have been discussed here are items that the Turner Center is actively engaged on with research. So, for example, impact fees, this is something we've extensively researched. Utilizing underutilized retail commercial space. This is something that we have a lot of research in as well. So all that to say is I'm happy to speak today about our work on JPAs, but more generally speaking, this is why the Turner Center is here, is to provide data and evidence to inform all of these conversations around the whole housing ecosystem. But today, I'm here to talk about the work that we did in partnership with Spur recently on JPAs. We are particularly interested in this topic for 2 reasons. The first is that we've observed a really significant increase in cost burdens for middle-income households. We released a paper this spring that saw about 50% of middle-income households in California are now considered rent burdened in that they pay more than 30% of their rent. That's a significant increase over the baseline year which we use, which is 2010, of about 10%. And so clearly this is an area that should be addressed, and the JPA model is one way to do that. Another reason why we're interested in this model is that we have long advocated for the use of property tax exemptions or abatements to help kickstart development in California and to really expand our toolbox, if you will, to create new housing throughout the state. So we dove into this topic in partnership with Spur. We interviewed a number of individuals who are interested in this topic, from affordable housing stakeholders to practitioners who are actively using the JPA model to acquire and build new housing today. In fact, some of the individuals who have spoken today were part of this effort as well. And our goal with this work is really to do two things. The first is to really explain the model. It is relatively new, and so our hope is that through this paper, we can lift up how the model works so that it can be more widely understood. The second is really to explore its potential as an affordable housing tool. California, because of our tax policy, is somewhat limited in the ways that we can use tax policy to incentivize the creation and construction of new housing. And so we wanted to examine whether or not the JPA model could be a way to address some of those limitations that we have in California. So we actually have found tremendous potential in the use of JPAs to create more deed-restricted affordable housing, precisely because it can circumvent the challenges we have as a state in implementing new housing tax policies. So while we've advocated for using tax abatements and exemptions in the past, it's come to our attention through our work that doing so in the way that, let's say, the New York 421A program or the Washington multifamily tax exemption program would require both a supermajority of the legislature, but also a ballot initiative to create such a program. And so the JPA model is a way to circumvent that really high hurdle to create a tax exemption incentive for the creation of middle-income housing. Also, as noted earlier by the speakers, this is fundamentally a different way to create deed-restricted housing that does not draw upon existing sources of subsidy that traditional nonprofit and for-profit affordable housing developers rely on. So there's tremendous potential there too. But we're also really interested in the other applications of this model. So not just in the way that it's been traditionally used so far, which is an acquisition model, but in the ways that other entities could potentially use the same model to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing, but also develop new construction. I think it's been mentioned once or twice that there are some projects that are utilizing a JPA model for new construction, and we see this as a really potentially powerful new tool as well. Some of the statistics have already been noted, but there's been almost 14,000 units that are now deed-restricted as a result of the JPA model since 2019. It's a significant number. But I think one of the other key factors of this proposal is that the deed restriction helps alleviate cost increases over time. So for example, in our paper, we highlight an example from the city of Hayward where the cap on rents there has already saved the tenants in that building because rents in Hayward have gone up over 6% year over year. We're seeing similar cost increases due to inflation throughout the state. And so we're already seeing potential savings to tenants as a result of these new deed restrictions. Now, to be clear, I think this has been mentioned before, there have been some critiques of the model. And I think it's worth addressing these and digging further into them as we further develop policies to harness the potential of the JPAs. So, for example, there's some concern that day one rent increases or decreases are potentially maybe not providing enough public benefit for the amount of tax revenue that's being foregone. I think a lot of the critiques are due mostly to I think individuals using the traditional lens of how affordable housing is financed and developed and applying it to this really new model. And so I think once we can really understand collectively how the model works and how it provides benefit, we can work through those challenges and really effectively harness the power of this JPA model to create more deed-restricted housing throughout the state in a way that doesn't use our existing affordable housing resources. So I'll just end by saying, we've talked a lot about all the different factors that go into addressing California's housing crisis, and it really necessitates a number of tools. There is no one policy or solution that's going to get us out of this, and the JPAs present an opportunity to expand that toolbox. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to my colleague, Mr. Lane from Spur.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. Members, Michael Lane with Spur, a public policy think tank in the San Francisco Bay Area. Could we advance the slides just about three into the presentation? One more. That's the one, thank you. So as you saw today, the JPAs are structured to take properties off the property tax rolls by making it a public asset. But we also need that type of a benefit for private land and private developments as well, and that's what we want to pitch to you as well, to build on this JPA model. The reason we had to set up a structure like that, it's unique to California, as you know, because of Proposition 13 and the way our property tax welfare exemption works. And so that's why you see this type of a structure, to get that benefit the other states are able to do just directly with a program that they can set up. We have those limitations in California. I want to provide some opportunities to try to work around that and to create some additional models that we could use going forward. Next slide, please. So this is the property tax welfare exemption. I just wanted to make some points here for you, but first I want to talk about how we're currently financing middle-income housing in California. You heard from CalHFA earlier today. Their mixed income program is really structured to encourage 100% affordable housing deals, to include some middle-income units and buildings with lower-income units, but it's not really for a market rate deal to include these units. And so we want to also build on that model and expand it so that we can bring in the market rate developers to also include units that otherwise would not be provided by the market. And in Spur's view, we should maximize the number of low-income units in 100% affordable developments that are already using various subsidy sources, and create new property tax incentives for market rate developments to include middle-income housing units that would not be otherwise provided by the market. In this scenario, the building would pay the local property taxes and then, when filing taxes, receive a credit or refund from the state's franchise tax board. Next slide, please. As you know, California's property tax welfare exemption, as was stated earlier, is only available to nonprofit organizations operating for charitable purposes. So that doesn't allow us to have market rate, to make that kind of a deal with a market rate developer, for-profit developer. They can't access it, and an amendment would be required to the California Constitution. And as was mentioned earlier, also our local taxing entities would lose that property tax revenue. So that creates some tensions as well. Next slide, please.
That's a polite way to put it. It creates some tension.
I'm sorry?
I said that's a polite way to frame it, as it creates some
Political
tension.
problem, yeah, exactly. Therefore, Spur's proposing a pilot program and advocating that a targeted state credit or refund be included in the state budget against local property taxes paid on market rate properties that include deed-restricted units affordable to middle-income households. This proposal would keep local jurisdictions whole while creating a meaningful incentive for-profit market rate developers to include middle-income housing in their buildings. This proposal doesn't require any amendments to the California State Constitution or change the distribution formula for local property taxes to the taxing entities under Proposition 13, and we'd love to work with you on this type of proposal. I think we can have a proof of concept and work with the administration and the legislature to provide that funding in the budget to then demonstrate how this can work in California. Thank you.
Is that your presentation, Mr.
That's
Lane?
it.
Oh, okay, thank you, I appreciate it, it was really succinct. Let me see, colleagues, do you have any questions? JPAs are very interesting. We've heard, at least I've heard from some of my assessors, they've expressed some frustration about JPAs like you were describing in your example of pulling off properties, parcels off the tax roll. Do we have a remedy? Maybe you can add some color or some context to what that relationship has been like
Yes,
on the ground.
That's currently the case for the property tax welfare exemption. Goes up 80% of AMI and below. And so we're really trying to hit that 80% to 120% of AMI. Many developers may not choose to do this for various reasons, but we do have, particularly in the high-cost areas, where we have projects that can't really move forward, this type of an incentive would be a great deal both for the developer and the jurisdiction and the middle-income households, where it would free up, particularly now because of construction costs, what they are, and cost of materials and labor, et cetera. We could actually move a pipeline that's currently stuck, and so you wouldn't have a rush for all developers wanting to take advantage of this. And you want to demonstrate that there is that public benefit, that these are rents that are below market. And I think if you have a structured program with a few $100 million, and you could set up the terms maybe for 10 years, you get that property tax refund or credit from the state, you'd actually move projects, create jobs, and create those middle-income units that would not be available provided by the market or by our current affordable housing system.
So colleagues, the JPA models that are highlighted here today is an example of what our cities and counties are implementing to address their local housing crisis. And you'll know I'm from San Francisco, so very familiar with the JPA model and structure, also familiar with both Turner Center and Spur. So while we are certainly encouraged by the local government efforts, I do just have a few questions about the public benefit, and I want to better understand the public benefit. Rent savings, I'll start there. And Mr. Barker, Mr. Rawson, if you guys want to participate, you can come on back down, and we'll love to hear your perspective. I'm not trying to create an unequal pitting against anyone against each other, but this is the space where we can have thoughtful conversation so that we can begin to figure a way out of this. So is it possible to highlight the average rent savings in each in these transactions? I believe I heard a 10% savings.
Well,
Hold on,
I'm sorry.
Mr. Barker. And is the 10% is the average?
So I think the difficult part about this program compared to the LIHTC program is the LIHTC program is pretty much the same across the board on deals. A lot of people want to compare this program to the LIHTC program, use the same nomenclature, use the same words, but it just doesn't translate well. In addition to that, each one of these public offerings could be wildly different from the next public offering. If you have a deal that's a 1980s deal versus a deal that's in construction right now converting, there's different scenarios. And so the basic idea is to create a public offering, have 3 different affordability buckets at AMI levels. Within those buckets, once you then try to then reduce 10%, 10% off the rent from there. So that's kind of the very generic way of putting it.
But I can quantify that, Madam Chair, if you don't mind. So in our portfolio, we've got 4,014 units. There's been 13,000, I think, 600 units. So, we've got a very good data source. So as a practitioner in traditional affordable housing and this program, I think we have really keen insight into the differences. What's interesting about this program, to Ben's point, we underwrite. So when we go to sell the bonds, and this is just, I can't speak for the other sponsors, but Waterford, we underwrite to a day one 12% discount to market. Now, what we've seen over the last year is record rent growth throughout the state of California. In Southern California, specifically LA County, Orange County, like for instance, Orange County saw 15% rent growth last year. So what we've now seen is that in our portfolio, in call it the 18 to 24 months that we've owned our assets, we have a weighted discount. So across 4,014 units, 24%. And so when critics say that the public benefits that we're creating don't justify the tax loss, I actually smile and say, well, come look at our portfolio, and I'm happy to sit there and walk you through every single one of our deals because we have the data that can show that. Okay. And so, I think it's a little different structure, and for those that aren't, particularly in the nuances of it, it takes a little while to, I think, distinguish the difference between a traditional tax credit model and this model.
Thank you. Mr. Garcia?
Yeah, so just to add some context to that, we looked at a number of deals and found fairly similar discounts to the market. It's not always the same across the board, depending on the affordability buckets which have been agreed upon with the city. And it is important to note, right, that this is a conversation with the city as well. So if the city would prefer to see deeper affordability, they have the opportunity to negotiate that too. I think where you really start to see public benefit is over time, because even if the discount to market is not as high as some people would like to see from day one, because you have capped rents moving forward. We're seeing this today, 6-8% increases. We wouldn't see those in a deed restricted unit. So that's not something that I've seen quantified yet, but just knowing the way that we've seen rent increases kind of take off in the state, having those deed restrictions in place from day one is an incredibly powerful tool to help mitigate rent increases over time.
Real quick, I want to just ask a question about possessory interest. And wanted to know if you're able to speak to the possessory interest issues that has been raised by the California Assessors Association. Are you familiar with their, I know you guys are nodding your head, but are you guys familiar with some of their?
I'm sure, what's the concern they're raising?
That it's lost revenue, basically, for the county.
Yeah, we also hear that with the property tax welfare exemption for affordable housing, quite
true, you do.
frankly,
That's true.
because those are all, tight budgets. I mean, it's been less of a concern over the past decade where we had economic growth and assessed values continue to grow, and as real estate changes hands, it's reassessed at a higher value, so that's been mitigated somewhat, I think, over the past decade. But that's always been an issue. It's just weighing various public goods and what we're willing to pay for, and we do need, I think, these investments to make the market work, certainly, and as long as our local elected officials, it's not just the assessors, but if the city council and the board of supervisors said this is our priority to invest in affordable housing, then they're the ones who make that call and not the assessor.
So my question is actually directed to all four of you. You know, I come from San Francisco, spent 8 years on the Board of Supervisors there, and a number of years chair of the Land Use and Development Committee. So this conversation can follow and definitely can understand, and also understand you're in Berkeley, you have a very unique rent control, very robust rent control commission. But, you know, I'm just wondering, how do we begin to get elected officials that are in these decision-making positions to better understand what's going on? Because it wasn't until I got elected and was in this world that I spent a lot more time understanding CEQA, understanding the planning process. So, you know, as you start to see elected officials, and they kind of fill the pipeline, right? Maybe start at school board, go on the Board of Supervisors or City Council, then they come into the legislature. And so, you know, San Francisco has produced Scott Wiener, who was speaking earlier today, who's been an authority on this area. Gavin Newsom comes out of San Francisco, also a former member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. So, you know, I mean, I guess the point is that you've got some heavy hitters coming out of the Bay Area that are dealing with real pressures when it comes to land use development, property tax, assessors, these roles, all of this. What can we be doing to better educate the folks that are the decision makers? Ben, I see you are like ready to get in. It's like double touch. And then David, I'll come over to you.
So having sat through probably 1,000+ public hearings in my life, for TEFRA hearings, I believe you brought up, I think that's where you were going, was the TEFRA hearings earlier for the tax credit deals where you have to have a public hearing, and it's called a TEFRA hearing. Those are very common in California. Most general city staff understands what a TEFRA is. The elected officials within the locales understand what a TEFRA is, understand the process. This form of financing is newer to California. While it's been around since World War I, it's really been more of an East Coast, maybe Chicago-style thing, and it's just making its way over here. 15 years ago, when I was doing TEFRAs, we were getting questioned every single public hearing. I was there for a long time going through, doing general education. Today, when I do a TEFRA, they sail through with 0 questions. People understand what's going on. I really
They
think.
don't care. I know.
Well, I think they
They're
just
probably better
understand,
educated.
they have a good understanding, maybe some just don't care, but I think people generally understand that you need to have a public hearing to be able to assess or access the tax-exempt bond market. This is a new financing structure for California. And I think it is just general education. Like we said, there's been 51 projects. There's probably been 80 cities that have gone through this now. Some have a good idea, some don't have a good idea, but honestly, I think it just takes a lot of hard work. We need the bond market to start working again so we can start bringing projects forward and we can better educate. I think, honestly, on our side of it, we've done a really bad job of holding maybe public forums, putting out information on how these deals work. This is new. It's like 1986 tax credits before people started getting bond allocation and tax credits, and there wasn't all these committees, there wasn't consortiums, there wasn't anything really. And that's what I hope to aim to do within this year, is to be able to start kind of a consortium, have everybody that's involved, and have a repository of information so that our friends over here, they can get up to the minute data, because that's really not available unless you ask. And I think that's honestly what's missing is the data. They don't have it. We need to provide it. We need to do a better job of educating on our side, and there needs to be some kind of an advocacy, not an advocacy group, but maybe a consortium for middle-income housing that more people are involved in this. And I think that's really the way to do it, at least in my opinion.
Mr. Garcia?
I'll just second that. As a researcher, I will always take more data, so please send it my way. The question was, how do we get people to a place where we understand this and there's more knowledge around these topics? And I will say,
So that we can make better policies, can we make better informed decisions and not succumb to politics, but have more data-driven
Yes.
solutions?
So I would say, please send them to me.
Okay.
This is why the Turner Center exists. This is why my role exists, is to make sure that that we have the ability to distill really complex topics, right? Housing by itself is very complex. And then you add, a new financing model like the JPAs, and you add LIHTC, and these are all very complex topics. And part of what we do at the Turner Center is try to break down these data sources and the research into really understandable publications and materials. And so things not just about JPAs, but also just understanding the math behind real estate development, understanding why impact fees are important, right? So all of these arcane things that maybe in isolation don't seem like they matter, but in the grand scheme of things, are actually quite important. So this is, again, why the Turner Center exists, why Carol started the center, was to be a resource for people who are grappling with these decisions every day and seeing the ramifications of decades of bad policy choices. So yes, send them to our website, I guess.
Not a problem. Mr. Lane, I just wanted to follow up on my question earlier about possessory interest and kind of what I am hearing county assessors give passionate feedback about. The assessors, they're asserting that if a person is paying market rate rent and not in an affordable units, they are subjected to a possessory interest tax. I just wanted to get that on the record, but I wanted to see if you had any comments about that.
So that hasn't been raised with us in our state.
Okay. This is something that's new?
Well, I mean, possessory income tax is not new to us, but it is being raised on these projects because you do have a range of buckets of affordability, and some people are paying market rate, but most of the property is not. And I think the issue is if somebody's paying market rate, that there could be a possessory tax on that specific unit and how to collect that. And I think that's something everybody's trying to work through, the legal ramifications and the tax ramifications of that. How do you have somebody that's paying market rate that's getting a benefit, you derive that, and then what would be that possessory income tax, if there is one due, and how do you collect it? I think from what I understand, and I could be totally wrong here, is that there isn't a concise tax opinion on that the local assessors are correct. Everybody's working through that, and honestly, right now, where there's this lull in the bond market's essentially dead right now just because of the fast increase and rising of rates and the outflows in the bonds. People are working on that right now, and everybody's trying to grapple and try to fix that so that hopefully when this program continues to move forward, there's a clear answer to whichever county you're working in.
Okay.
And I would just say quickly, I think for the pilot program that we're proposing, that would not actually be an issue the way we're trying to structure it, in terms of the benefit that the tenants would receive and how the tax rebate would work.
Got it. Mr. Rawson, do you want to?
No, I think Ben touched on it. I mean, what I will say is, actually, I will add to that, is that, so the possessory interest topic has come up. We've had our tax counsel, Myers-Nave, do numerous opinion letters on this. And, our investors are some of the largest, most sophisticated muni investors in the world. It's the same investors that would buy California bonds, so it's a who's who of investors. And it's come up. We are of the opinion that that these projects will be exempt from that. There are certain instances, and I'll give you an example, a real-world example. We own a project in the city of Pasadena that has a retail component, and that would be subject to it. But that's fine that they're paying market. It's essentially, we have market rate retail tenants as part of the project, and that's de minimis. To be clear, our tax counsel as of now has stated that, that would be the only portion to the project that would qualify for that.
All right, thank you. I'm going to open up, I think, no question? Okay. All right, thank you yes, Mr. Cuddy.
I just was going to say that we have one more speaker from item 5.
Okay.
From Seattle. She's on.
Ready to go? Perfect.
She's queued up.
Thank you. We're going to call up our next speaker at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, good evening.
Hello.
Everyone hear me okay?
Yes, thank you. Hi, how are you?
All right. Hi, I'm well. I am going to introduce myself and then
Please.
call up my presentation. So I'll just need a moment to do that. I'm Jennifer LeBrecq. I'm with the City of Seattle Office of Housing. We are a small executive office within the City of Seattle. And I'm the manager for market incentives, land use, and sustainability. I manage our multifamily tax exemption program, which is what I'm here to talk to you about tonight.
Okay.
I'm going to have one caveat before I begin. I'm home with my son. He might come in and interrupt us. You probably all have been familiar with that over the last couple of years, so please bear with me if he does.
Not a problem.
I'm going to take a, all right, I'm going to take a moment and open up my presentation. All right. Can everyone see that?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, great. And I think if I understood correctly, you have all you've been doing this all day. So I know it's the end of a long day, so I will try to be as engaging as possible. This is about 10 minutes, and then I'm happy to take any questions at the end.
Thank you.
So I'm really excited to be here tonight, and I thank you for inviting me to share our experience at the City of Seattle about operating a tax exemption program. The state of Washington has offered or authorized basically a tax exemption program in return for developers offering income and rent restricted units since 1995. And the city has chosen to adopt that locally since 1998. So the way it works is there's a state statute which authorizes the program, and then local jurisdictions can decide whether or not they want to offer it. The state statute sets minimum requirements, including affordability levels and set-aside percentages, but jurisdictions can always opt to be more stringent than what's in the state statute, which the City of Seattle over time has chosen to do. I think the way that our program works is that developers apply. They can apply anytime up till 6 months before getting temporary certificate of occupancy. They submit an initial application. If approved, they submit both an initial and final application. And once approved, they get a tax exemption on the residential portion of their building in return for income and rent restricting 20 or 25% of the units in their building for a 12-year period of time. So the tax exemption lasts for 12 years, and the affordability period also lasts for 12 years. That is the City of Seattle's program. The state one is a bit different, has higher income limits and although the same set aside. Although the program could be available for rehabs, I don't think we've ever seen that happen. It is exclusively used by developers doing new construction. One thing I just want to know is participation is voluntary. A developer can apply and decide before they get TCO not to participate. They can start the tax exemption, get 2 or 3 years into it, and decide they just don't want to do it anymore and pull out, although we actually haven't really seen that happen. But it's just important to note that while it is a restricted unit, unlike other publicly funded units, there's no sort of regulatory agreement guaranteeing that restriction for a certain period of time. I'll talk you through our current MFTE program. So just some context, our program currently has over 5,800 income and rent restricted units created through the MFTE program. So it is a sizable program. It's been around for a number of years, so that is part of it, but we've actually just seen a lot of growth and a really increased interest in the program, I would say, over the last 10 years. So a pretty explosive growth in terms of the number of rent-restricted units created through the program over that period of time. Under our current version of the program, 20 or 25% of the units have to be income and rent restricted, and I have the AMI levels here at the side. I want to note that our affordability levels have definitely gone down over time. If you look at projects that vested under some of the original versions of the program back in 1998 or soon after, Income limits were much higher, sometimes in the 80% to 90% AMI range. And frankly, we're not getting any rent buy down from market for those older units. Over time, I think as we've gotten better at analyzing the program and clearer about the public benefit that we want to achieve, income limits have gone down for the program. So, and we'll talk more about this. These income limits that you see here in some markets in Seattle are getting us a significant rent buy down. In other submarkets in Seattle that are weaker, we're really not getting much of a rent buy down. And the program is offered across the city in any area that is zoned for multifamily. This just gives you a sense of what we've created. These are all the active units that are currently in our portfolio. As you can see, this is primarily what we would call a workforce housing tool. So we're creating units generally between 60 to 80% AMI. We have a few units that are regulated lower, that are really CDUs, small efficiency dwelling units that are a particular kind of unit created in the city that are very small. And I just put the income and rent limits below here as well, because I think it's just good to check in about what this actually means for a household. You know, I think as many folks are probably familiar with, and I'm sorry, I just lost my presentation. Okay, I think as many folks are probably familiar with, there was a pretty large increase in median income from 2021 to 2022, and that subsequently means a pretty high jump in both income limits and in rent limits for these types of programs. So a one-person household in a one-bedroom regulated at 75% AMI is paying a rent of $1,819. I heard some discussion about this during the last presentation. I always like to remind people, and I think everyone sitting here knows, MFTE is not free. There is a cost to it, although the cost is always more complicated to explain than other programs. In 2022, the lost property tax revenue associated with these multifamily tax exemptions will be approximately $29.48 million, and that's across multiple taxing jurisdictions, so not just the city of Seattle, but King County, school districts, fire district, and the total amount of lost revenue for all projects that are currently active between 2010 and 2022 is $145 million. And I think folks are familiar, you know, the lost revenue is really the revenue that is foregone, that is not collected, at least in the state of Washington, because those properties were not added to the tax base. We also, so for our tax exemption program, some of the tax impact is in the form of foregone or lost revenue, and some of the tax impact is actually in the form of shifted tax revenue, where that tax burden is shifted onto other taxpayers. I have to be honest, there's no specific policy decision or policy rationale between what's foregone and what's shifted. It is actually just truly a matter of when the assessor's office drives around and does their assessments. It's just a kind of wacky timing issue. In 2022, there was $65.9 million of tax savings for owners that were shifted onto other taxpayers, again, not just in Seattle, but in other taxing jurisdictions. And for the median value home in Seattle, that resulted in an additional $72 in property taxes for 2022. I wanted to really make a point here that our experience at the Office of Housing has been that when you offer a tax exemption program like this, compliance monitoring is a must. So I want to talk, and I'll talk more in the next few slides about both what I see as the benefits of this program and then also the cautions that I would offer based on our long experience with it. The Office of Housing has 2 full-time compliance monitoring staff for MFTE and other incentive units, although MFTE comprises the vast majority of those. You know, they're collecting and reviewing these annual reports to ensure that tenants are being charged the correct rents, that units are being leased to income-qualified households. They're conducting on-site audits. They do a lot of training and technical assistance for property management staff, so they offer webinars and pre-COVID in-person trainings. They answer, I put hundreds, it could be thousands of tenant calls every year. from tenants who either are in an MFTE unit and have an issue about something or question about something their property manager is doing, or from tenants who are interested in leasing an MFTE property. And for each MFTE property, that property is responsible for leasing their units and for doing the income qualification associated with ensuring that the tenant goes to, or that the unit goes to an income qualified household. But folks find us on the website and they know that we're involved, so we do get a lot of those calls and we have to be staffed up for them. And then they develop and maintain some handbooks for both renters and property managers. So what I see as the benefit and what the city sees as the benefit of this program is first that we have over 5,000 rent and income restricted units and market rate apartments throughout the city. So we are achieving economic integration. We have these units in neighborhoods that we find it incredibly difficult to build subsidized affordable housing in, and primarily because of the land cost. So we are able to get a better geographic dispersion of income and rent restricted units than we would be just through the work that we do to subsidize units. We also do capital investments to create nonprofit or housing authority owned properties. We also see those units integrated throughout the building, right? So that's one of our sort of core values, is that we don't want to see all the MFTE units on the bottom floor. We really want to see them integrated throughout the building so that nobody knows what's a restricted unit and what's not. The units are secured for income qualified tenants. So we know that, just because a unit's affordable doesn't mean that it's going to be rented by a low income household. MFTE has a process in place to ensure that those units are reserved for households who need them based on their income. I also heard conversation about this. Production can happen concurrently to subsidize housing production. We have a huge affordable housing crisis in Washington State and in Seattle as well. And we know that our nonprofit sector, while they're fabulous, cannot solve this problem on their own. So this is a way for market rate developers to also be contributing to creating these income and rent restricted units for lower or moderate income households, and to basically be able to do more at the same time. I will say later units in this program have a rent moderator. So as I mentioned, we've seen big increases in median income over the last few years. Older projects that vested under older versions of this program do not have a rent moderator. So some of those units have seen rent increases of, this past year, 12% maximum allowable rent increase, which I think is just problematic for housing stability and the kind of housing stability we hope to create with these types of programs. In the last iteration of our MFTE program, we did introduce a rent moderator with really the intention of supporting housing stability regardless of what's happening with median incomes. So then program cautions and considerations. And I chose the word caution here carefully, I think, because I really think that there's a lot of benefits to these kind of tax exemption programs and things that should be seriously considered before undertaking them. I don't think this is not a panacea. It's frankly not easy, right? I think that this involves a lot of work and frankly a lot of work to do it well and to ensure that the public benefit is being achieved. It's difficult to calibrate the program correctly to achieve the desired public benefit. So just as I heard the discussion, one of the main public benefits that we want to get is a buy down from whatever the market rate rent is, right? If you're not getting the buy down, then there's probably not a reason to be providing the tax exemption. The market is constantly evolving. It shifts, it changes from year to year. One thing that we've seen happening, over the last few years in Seattle is increasingly smaller units where you might have like a one bedroom that's under, 350, 325 square feet. The pricing on that's really changing. It's hard to pin down what's the right affordability level for this unit when things are changing and evolving constantly. Rent and income restrictions, at least in our program, and it may be different at what you're looking at, only last 12 years, although the state did recently authorize jurisdictions to offer a 12-year exemption. I'm sorry, a 12-year extension. So for some projects, they may ultimately be able to go to 24 years. That obviously has an impact on the tenant living in the unit when that affordability period ends. That tenant no longer has an income and rent restriction protection and they are just going to get market rent. And I think there's some theories that because the building will be older, that the rent will sort of be more naturally affordable and it will all work out. But I don't know if that will always be the case. I think that's really going to depend on the type of building, the condition of the building, and the particular submarket that it's in. And also that there's not a lasting outcome. So, we've invested, perhaps through the tax exemption, millions of dollars in that particular building over a 12 or 24-year period. And at the end of that exemption period, the unit goes back to market and there's really no value, which we think about at the Office of Housing because we also make capital investments in affordable housing that is regulated for 75 years. So yes, we're investing a significant money on day one, but we know when we do that we're getting a project that's going to provide affordability for 75 years. And this is a very different outcome. And finally, I would just say that obtaining and maintaining public value is a time and staff intensive effort. If you just, build something and offer it and then say, okay, our job is done, and you walk away, I can guarantee that the public benefit will be eroded over time as the market shifts. As I talked about, I think there does need to be some kind of compliance monitoring, and not even to catch people, developers doing something wrong, but just because we found that property managers have a large amount of people leaving, coming and going. We need to provide ongoing training and technical assistance. We need to be invested in those projects to make them a success and to ensure that they are achieving the kind of support and help to low and moderate income tenants that we want to achieve. So I'm gonna stop there. Happy to share this PowerPoint as well with my contact information and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lebrecq. Lebrecq, thank you. Just let's see, a couple of questions. Let me check with my colleagues. No question. Any questions on this end? No, okay. Do you have any advice for the state of California as we begin to embark down a new pathway at looking at tax abatement to spur housing?
I think it is to carefully think about what kind of public benefit you hope to achieve with it. I think the more that public benefit can be established at the state level, the better, right? I mean, that is the sort of the overarching requirements that will then lead down to jurisdictions. I know that recently the state of Washington has beefed up sort of their staff support for local implementation of the MFTE program, which has been very helpful. A jurisdiction like Seattle is high capacity. We have a lot of staff to work on this. There are many smaller jurisdictions offering a tax exemption program that don't have a lot of staff, don't have a lot of housing experts, and want to do it right, but are struggling to do it well. So I think that's an important one. Again, I think you have to have, it's not enough just to create the policy. We have to think about how to implement it in order to ensure that that public value is both achieved and also maintained. And I think my final is just this question about, from my perspective, tax exemption programs work best or should really produce something that the market is not producing. And that is often, it doesn't have to be, but it often is rents that are below what the market would otherwise be producing. And I think real consideration should go into how are we going to set this program up to ensure that there is sufficient rent buy down, really like sufficient from what the market would otherwise do to justify the tax exemption that is being provided.
Thank you. I appreciate that perspective. Mr. Vasquez, my colleague, has a question for you.
Just a quick one. Actually, two. One, in Seattle, what's the percentage of renters versus homeowners?
Ooh, good question. There's more renters than homeowners, but I can't tell you the exact percentage.
Okay. And then you mentioned, obviously one of the incentives is the keeping it an affordable rent. What's the average rent?
That's also a good question that I don't know off the top of my head right now.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Well, we are going to say goodbye. We're going to thank you for your presentation, and we're going to keep moving on with the close of our very long work day. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Okay. Ms. Giacchetti.
The next item on today's board work group agenda is item 8, overview of the day and next work group convening.
Well, I'd like to thank all the participants in the first meeting of the Property Tax Abatement Work Group. I think you would agree that it was very rich with information, inspiring as well. We look forward to the next meeting next month. We will be pulling together the agenda. I want to acknowledge a few members that have just been incredibly helpful in pulling all of this together. Regina Evans on my staff, thank you very much. Hasib has also been equally as instrumental, and John Thiela, all three of whom are with us today, and then Melissa and Kimberly are watching both online, and want to just also recognize Mr. Vasquez and your outstanding staff and leadership has been really helpful. Miss Yvette Stowers, you stepping in the middle of planning. All of this has been incredible. It's been a heavy lift. Wanted to see if you, Mr. Nanjo or Mr. Young, had any comments or any thoughts that you wanted to reflect on some of the things that you've heard here today. I'm not putting you on the spot. If you don't have anything, you don't have to say anything, but next month, we look forward to hearing from Mr. David Young, who you'll have to the next board meeting, to the next work group meeting to synthesize and process and synthesize everything that you've heard today. And, I'd like to begin to think about a pathway forward for this body as we begin to figure out our role in this space. I want to invite Mr. Vasquez to take a time to provide a few remarks about the day, and then we'll close out.
Yes, I'd also like to thank staff, especially your staff, Madam Chair, and staff from the BOE, because I know, especially for Ms. Stowers, she kind of came in the middle of this. And really the speakers, the wealth of information that was shared with us today from all, both on the development side as well as the nonprofit, versus some of the market rate folks as well. And I just would like to remind the members, my colleagues here, that, make sure we take in all this information so when we do regroup back in August, we can begin hopefully to have a healthy discussion, as well as, I know we'll have some other speakers as well, to really kind of get into what is going to be realistic, maybe even lay out some like short-term and long-term goals of where we're going with this, both on the abatement side as well as the tax credits that we've heard about today. And once again, Madam Chair, your staff was outstanding.
Thank you.
And really want to thank them all.
All right, thank you
Can
very
I
much.
interrupt real quick?
Excuse
Before
me,
we
I'm
go
sorry.
May I interrupt, please?
Yes.
Before we adjourn, I would like to go to the AT&T moderator, to see if we have anybody who wants to make a public comment on the events of the day. AT&T moderator, please let us know if there's anyone on the line who would like to make a public comment regarding the agenda for the day.
Of course. Ladies and gentlemen, if you do wish to make a public comment, please press 1, then 0. And there's currently no one in the queue.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, with that, I'll say we are adjourned. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes?
Malia, well, in closing, I want to commend Peter, Kim, and David being here all day with us. It's very impressive, and I want to commend Ms. Cohen for introducing us to so many fascinating people that we would not have otherwise met. I would like to adjourn our meeting today in memory of the 100th birthday today of a marvelous individual that's had an effect on everybody's life, one of the main entertainment people in our nation, Norman Lear, who brought us All in the Family, who brought us Maude, brought us Sanford and Sons, brought us
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
the deficits.
Excuse me, sir, just real quick. I'm getting a signal from our, Ms. Cicchetti and our executive director. I think they have some comments they want to
Yes,
share.
you go ahead. Okay. We need to adjourn first the tax abatement work group.
Thank you.
And then we need to reconvene the meeting, the board meeting, because we only went into recess yesterday, so that we could take up the last item.
Thank you. Thank you for
stand
that
corrected. Thank you.
formality and clarity. So our first meeting of the property tax abatement work group is, I think it's been extremely informative and fundamental to the work that we've embarked upon, and I look forward to the additional meetings and the continued discussions about the possibilities of using property tax abatements to incentivize housing development here in our state. I have no further comments, and with that, I'd like to adjourn the board work group meeting. Thank you. And with that, I also would like to announce
And reconvene.
I'd like to announce and reconvene the Board of Equalization Day 2 regularly scheduled meeting. And now I'd like to close, no, Ms. Cicchetti, come on, just say it.
Yes, you can close, yes, if you'd like.
All right, I'd like to close the board meeting. Thank you.
She's going to.